Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, please drop a like and consider subscribing. Also, I would love to know where you all are watching from. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Some hospitals inspire confidence the moment you step inside. Polished floors reflect fluorescent lights. Nurses move swiftly, and the hum of life support machines fills the air with a quiet, steady rhythm. But for thousands of patients in Australia during the early 2000s, that confidence was misplaced. In the corridors of Bundaberg Base Hospital and other facilities where he worked, Dr. Jayant Patel walked among the living and the dying, and the line between healing and harm blurred in ways few could have imagined. Jayant Patel was not an ordinary surgeon. To the public and hospital administrators, he seemed impressive, highly credentialed, internationally trained, charismatic, and fluent in the jargon of modern medicine. In the early 2000s, he was hired at Bundaberg Base Hospital in Queensland, a facility accustomed to busy wards, overworked staff, and the occasional emergency that stretched resources to their limits. Patel's arrival was greeted with optimism. He promised expertise, new techniques, and improvements in patient care. To those watching from outside the operating theater, it seemed as though a master had arrived to elevate the institution. Yet beneath that veneer of professionalism, a pattern of negligence and recklessness began to emerge. First subtly, then unmistakably. Patel performed surgeries that were unnecessary, incomplete, or outright dangerous. Patients who would have survived under competent care often returned to their beds with complications that should have been preventable. Infections, internal bleeding, perforations, and failed procedures that no one in the hospital fully anticipated. The first signs were dismissed. Hospital administrators were overworked, understaffed, and unfamiliar with the meticulous scrutiny required to detect surgical errors in real time. Complaints from nurses or junior doctors were often downplayed. Patel was competent, they were told. Internationally trained. A rising star. If there were adverse outcomes, surely it was just part of the risks inherent in surgery. But as months passed, the anomalies multiplied. Patients who should have had routine recoveries languished in intensive care units. Mortality rates climbed. Families were frustrated, bewildered, and sometimes enraged. Some questioned whether these were coincidences, a string of bad luck amplified by bureaucratic inertia. Others whispered suspicions that something more deliberate, or at least negligent, was at play. Patel's methods were inconsistent, unpredictable, and often reckless. He sometimes left procedures incomplete, relying on junior staff to finish tasks they were neither trained nor authorized to perform. He ignored post-operative protocols. He misdiagnosed patients, and he often deflected blame, projecting confidence while hiding mistakes behind paperwork, vague explanations, and the authority his position afforded him. One particularly tragic case involved a young man undergoing surgery for what should have been a routine bowel obstruction. Patel's operation was incomplete. Post-operative complications ensued, including severe infection and internal bleeding. The patient required multiple corrective surgeries, each one risking further damage. When questioned, Patel downplayed the issues, insisting that complications were expected and unavoidable. As the list of adverse outcomes grew, whistleblowers began to emerge. Nurses, junior doctors, and even some senior colleagues documented mistakes, irregularities, and the unnerving frequency with which patients deteriorated after Patel's procedures. Internal reviews found alarming lapses, missing consent forms, incomplete surgical notes, unexplained deviations from standard procedures, and repeated failures to follow basic safety protocols. But perhaps the most disturbing element was Patel's demeanor. He remained calm, charming, and persuasive even in the face of repeated errors. Staff who confronted him reported that he would smile, nod, and reassure them while simultaneously minimizing the severity of the incidents. His presence was magnetic. Patients trusted him. Families praised him. Administrators were reluctant to act. Yet that same presence masked a pattern of harm that continued unchecked. The public only became aware of the full scope of Patel's negligence after media investigations and governmental inquiries revealed a shocking reality. Between 2000 and 2005, dozens of patients died as a direct or indirect result of his care. Others suffered permanent disabilities, including severe infections, organ damage, and lifelong impairments. It was not malicious in the traditional sense of criminal intent, yet the consequences were no less fatal. Legal and regulatory responses were protracted. Patel faced multiple charges, including manslaughter and grievous bodily harm. Investigations scrutinized patient records, surgical logs, and testimonies from staff who had witnessed the preventable complications. He was eventually struck from the medical register in Australia, a formal acknowledgement that his actions, or lack thereof, had crossed the threshold of professional competence. The case raised urgent questions about oversight, credential verification, and institutional accountability. How could an internationally trained surgeon perform for years in multiple hospitals without detection? How did systemic failures, overwork, and blind trust allow harm to accumulate? The Bundaberg Base Hospital scandal prompted widespread reform in Australia, including stricter licensing standards, comprehensive surgical audits, and enhanced whistleblower protections. Yet for families affected by Patel's errors, the reforms arrived too late. Some lost parents, spouses, or children. Others endured years of medical complications, hospitalizations, and psychological trauma. Survivors described a haunting pattern, entering the hospital with hope and leaving with injuries, infections, or grief. Some recalled Patel's calm, professional presence even as their loved ones deteriorated, an eerie reminder that authority, when unchecked, can become a silent agent of harm. Patel's story also became a lesson in the limits of charisma and perception. He was intelligent, articulate, and persuasive, capable of deflecting suspicion with ease. Staff often hesitated to challenge him, fearing repercussions or doubting their own judgment against his expertise. His confidence became a shield, masking the dangerous reality behind polished words and practiced gestures. Even now, more than a decade later, discussions of the Bundaberg cases serve as a cautionary tale in medical circles worldwide. The legacy of Dr. Death is not only the lives lost and harmed, but also the understanding that hospitals, no matter how well-resourced, are vulnerable to human error compounded by hierarchy, intimidation, and complacency. It underscores the fragile balance between trust in professionals and the need for independent oversight. Walking through Australian hospitals today, one can see the changes in practice and protocol. Audits, peer reviews, and transparent reporting are now expected. Yet the memory of Patel's patients lingers in quiet corners of corridors, in the whispered stories of nurses, in the sobering statistics that remind staff that authority alone is never a safeguard. Death can come quietly, disguised as care, and sometimes the person we expect to save us is the one whose mistakes can harm the most. Up next is a story that proves how some horrors are not hidden in shadows. Some do not move silently down hallways or lurk behind charts. Some appear in broad daylight, advertised in newspapers, praised in magazines, and embraced by the very families who trust them most. This is the story of Linda Hazard, the woman who turned fasting into a weapon and wellness into a death sentence. In the early 1900s, health fads were everywhere. People were fascinated with purity, with cleansing, with the belief that modern ailments are caused not by germs or malnutrition, but by toxins lingering in the body. Newspapers reported on new diets, magazines published testimonials, and anyone with a wealthy patient's money could find a way to exploit that desire for health. Among them, Dr. Linda Hazard, though technically a medical practitioner with minimal formal training, found her niche. She had studied fasting therapy in California, but not in any way that would prepare her for ethical practice. By 1905, she had opened the Hazard Sanitarium in Olalla, Washington, on the shores of Puget Sound. The location was idyllic. Dense, evergreen forests, clean air, a quiet isolation that promised health and serenity. Patients came seeking cures for obesity, digestive disorders, even mental fatigue. And many were wealthy enough to pay substantial sums for her guidance. At first glance, Hazard seemed devoted to her work. She welcomed patients into the sanitarium with a calm smile and a soft voice, explaining the virtues of fasting, rest, and spiritual cleansing. She presented charts, measurements, and anecdotal success stories, convincing families that she had unlocked secrets hidden from conventional medicine. Yet beneath her genteel exterior, something darker thrived, an obsession with control over life and death, and a willingness to push the limits of human endurance far beyond ethical bounds. Hazard's method was both simple and terrifying: extreme fasting. Some patients were instructed to eat nothing at all for weeks at a time, allowed only water or small amounts of herbal teas. Their bodies, starved of calories and essential nutrients, weakened rapidly. Weight dropped at alarming rates. Skin pallid, eyes sunken, hearts strained under the pressure of malnutrition. Hazard claimed this was therapeutic. She called it purification. Families, sometimes naive, sometimes desperate, trusted her implicitly. Yet patients began to die, not slowly, but with an eerie predictability. One wealthy guest, a man suffering from what Hazard described as malaise, starved for 6 weeks, his body wasting until organs failed. Another, a woman, became delirious from prolonged fasting, then slipped into coma before her family realized anything was wrong. Hazard remained calm, monitoring charts, writing notes, convincing grieving relatives that their loved ones had succumbed to prior ailments, not to the regimen itself. Some visitors, skeptical at first, noticed the unnatural pallor, the hollow cheeks, the listless movements of those who were still alive. Nurses or attendants occasionally tried to intervene, but Hazard's authority, backed by persuasive rhetoric and the promise of health, kept them silent. Her influence was formidable, her control near absolute. The sanitarium's isolated location only amplified it. Help was hours away, the nearest hospital distant, and transportation expensive. Patients were trapped in her system once admitted. Over the years, Hazard's notoriety grew, not among law enforcement, but among high society. Articles lauded her as a miracle worker, praising her methods, publishing testimonials of those who claimed miraculous cures. Yet the death toll mounted quietly. Exact numbers are hard to verify, but historians estimate at least 40 patients died under her care. Some families pursued legal action, but she skillfully navigated courts, sometimes by moving patients across state lines, sometimes by invoking technicalities in licensing law, sometimes by claiming consent had been given. The case that finally brought her to justice involved Claire Williamson, a wealthy woman suffering from obesity. Hazard had recommended a fasting regimen that extended beyond Claire's physical limits. When Claire's husband visited, he noticed his wife's rapid deterioration, her trembling hands, and her vacant gaze. Alarmed, he contacted authorities. Investigators arrived, discovering the extent of Hazard's practices. Rooms filled with frail bodies, charts documenting fasts that extended weeks beyond what a human body could tolerate, and a woman who defended her methods as science. At trial, Hazard was audacious. She argued that she believed in her treatment, that deaths were a natural consequence of the patient's prior conditions, that fasting was therapeutic when supervised correctly. Yet the jury could not ignore the evidence. Multiple deaths, consistent patterns, and testimony from attendants who described Hazard's calm demeanor as she watched patients weaken, sometimes begging for food, sometimes pleading for water. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman so consumed by ideology that she had abandoned morality entirely. Hazard was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to life imprisonment. Yet even in prison, she maintained her belief in fasting therapy, offering advice to anyone who would listen, defending her practices as the natural path to health. She remained unrepentant, her charisma undimmed, even as the shadows of the deaths she caused lingered in the minds of families and survivors. The broader implications of the Hazard case are chilling. It underscores how authority, combined with isolation and social trust, can create an environment where abuse is normalized. It reveals how pseudoscience can cloak malevolent intent, how wealthy families can be seduced into fatal compliance, and how systems meant to protect the vulnerable can fail entirely when oversight is inadequate. Her sanitarium became both laboratory and death chamber, her victims pawns in a cruelly rationalized ideology. Yet even beyond the statistics, the human dimension is haunting. Survivors recalled the weight of hunger pressing against their ribs, the delirium that blurred the lines between dreams and reality, the eerie calm of the woman who administered the regimen. For families, grief was compounded by the realization that the promise of health had become the instrument of death. Letters, diaries, and newspaper clippings from the era preserved the emotional toll. Hope turned into despair, trust into betrayal, vitality into stillness. The starved bodies themselves left an imprint. Coroners described extreme emaciation, organ failure, and physiological collapse that were impossible to ignore. Witnesses testified to the frailty, the confusion, the hopelessness in the eyes of those who lived under Hazard's care. The deaths were not instantaneous, nor were they painless. They unfolded slowly, methodically, in rooms meant for healing, under the guidance of a woman who smiled and reassured families as life drained away. Even after Hazard's conviction, the sanitarium's legacy persisted. Some former patients never fully recovered from the prolonged fasting. Some families never forgave themselves for trusting her. And in Olalla, Washington, local history keeps her memory alive, not as a pioneer of health, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority, isolation, and ideology masquerading as medical practice. Some hospitals inspire confidence the moment you step inside. Polished floors reflect fluorescent lights. Nurses move swiftly, and the hum of life support machines fills the air with a quiet, steady rhythm. But for thousands of patients in Australia during the early 2000s, that confidence was misplaced. In the corridors of Bundaberg Base Hospital and other facilities where he worked, Dr. Jayant Patel walked among the living and the dying, and the line between healing and harm blurred in ways few could have imagined. Jayant Patel was not an ordinary surgeon. To the public and to hospital administrators, he seemed impressive, highly credentialed, internationally trained, charismatic, and fluent in the jargon of modern medicine. In the early 2000s, he was hired at Bundaberg Base Hospital in Queensland, a facility accustomed to busy wards, overworked staff, and the occasional emergency that stretched resources to their limits. Patel's arrival was greeted with optimism. He promised expertise, new techniques, and improvements in patient care. To those watching from outside the operating theater, it seemed as though a master had arrived to elevate the institution. Yet beneath that veneer of professionalism, a pattern of negligence and recklessness began to emerge, first subtly, then unmistakably. Patel performed surgeries that were unnecessary, incomplete, or outright dangerous. Patients who would have survived under competent care often returned to their beds with complications that should have been preventable. Infections, internal bleeding, perforations, and failed procedures that no one in the hospital fully anticipated. The first signs were dismissed. Hospital administrators were overworked, understaffed, and unfamiliar with the meticulous scrutiny required to detect surgical errors in real time. Complaints from nurses or junior doctors were often downplayed. Patel was competent, they were told. Internationally trained. A rising star. If there were adverse outcomes, surely it was just part of the risks inherent in surgery. But as months passed, the anomalies multiplied. Patients who should have had routine recoveries languished in intensive care units. Mortality rates climbed. Families were frustrated, bewildered, and sometimes enraged. Some questioned whether these were coincidences, a string of bad luck amplified by bureaucratic inertia. Others whispered suspicions that something more deliberate, or at least negligent, was at play. Patel's methods were inconsistent, unpredictable, and often reckless. He sometimes left procedures incomplete, relying on junior staff to finish tasks they were neither trained nor authorized to perform. He ignored post-operative protocols. He misdiagnosed patients, and he often deflected blame, projecting confidence while hiding mistakes behind paperwork, vague explanations, and the authority his position afforded him. One particularly tragic case involved a young man undergoing surgery for what should have been a routine bowel obstruction. Patel's operation was incomplete. Post-operative complications ensued, including severe infection and internal bleeding. The patient required multiple corrective surgeries, each one risking further damage. When questioned, Patel downplayed the issues, insisting that complications were expected and unavoidable. As the list of adverse outcomes grew, whistleblowers began to emerge. Nurses, junior doctors, and even some senior colleagues documented mistakes, irregularities, and the unnerving frequency with which patients deteriorated after Patel's procedures. Internal reviews found alarming lapses, missing consent forms, incomplete surgical notes, unexplained deviations from standard procedures, and repeated failures to follow basic safety protocols. But perhaps the most disturbing element was Patel's demeanor. He remained calm, charming, and persuasive even in the face of repeated errors. Staff who confronted him reported that he would smile, nod, and reassure them while simultaneously minimizing the severity of the incidents. His presence was magnetic. Patients trusted him. Families praised him. Administrators were reluctant to act. Yet that same presence masked a pattern of harm that continued unchecked. The public only became aware of the full scope of Patel's negligence after media investigations and governmental inquiries revealed a shocking reality. Between 2000 and 2005, dozens of patients died as a direct or indirect result of his care. Others suffered permanent disabilities, including severe infections, organ damage, and lifelong impairments. It was not malicious in the traditional sense of criminal intent, yet the consequences were no less fatal. Legal and regulatory responses were protracted. Patel faced multiple charges, including manslaughter and grievous bodily harm. Investigations scrutinized patient records, surgical logs, and testimonies from staff who had witnessed the preventable complications. He was eventually struck from the medical register in Australia, a formal acknowledgement that his actions, or lack thereof, had crossed the threshold of professional competence. The case raised urgent questions about oversight, credential verification, and institutional accountability. How could an internationally trained surgeon perform for years in multiple hospitals without detection? How did systemic failures, overwork, and blind trust allow harm to accumulate? The Bundaberg-based hospital scandal prompted widespread reform in Australia, including stricter licensing standards, comprehensive surgical audits, and enhanced whistleblower protections. Yet for families affected by Patel's errors, the reforms arrived too late. Some lost parents, spouses, or children. Others endured years of medical complications, hospitalizations, and psychological trauma. Survivors described a haunting pattern, entering the hospital with hope and leaving with injuries, infections, or grief. Some recalled Patel's calm, professional presence even as their loved ones deteriorated, an eerie reminder that authority, when unchecked, can become a silent agent of harm. Patel's story also became a lesson in the limits of charisma and perception. He was intelligent, articulate, and persuasive, capable of deflecting suspicion with ease. Staff often hesitated to challenge him, fearing repercussions or doubting their own judgment against his expertise. His confidence became a shield, masking the dangerous reality behind polished words and practiced gestures. Even now, more than a decade later, discussions of the Bundaberg cases serve as a cautionary tale in medical circles worldwide. The legacy of Dr. Death is not only the lives lost and harmed, but also the understanding that hospitals, no matter how well-resourced, are vulnerable to human error compounded by hierarchy, intimidation, and complacency. It underscores the fragile balance between trust in professionals and the need for independent oversight. Walking through Australian hospitals today, one can see the changes in practice and protocol. Audits, peer reviews, and transparent reporting are now expected. Yet the memory of Patel's patience lingers in quiet corners of corridors, in the whispered stories of nurses, in the sobering statistics that remind staff that authority alone is never a safeguard. Death can come quietly, disguised as care, and sometimes the person we expect to save us is the one whose mistakes can harm the most. Next up is the case of Richard Kuklinski. The streets of New Jersey were quiet at night. Factories rose like dark silhouettes along the riverbanks, their windows glowing faintly from late-shift crews. Suburban homes blinked with porch lights, spaced evenly along winding streets. The hum of traffic from the turnpike drifted in and out, soft and distant. Life seemed ordinary, unremarkable, even peaceful. Yet inside one modest house, behind drawn curtains and familiar routines, Richard Kuklinski lived a double life few could have imagined. To neighbors he was polite, steady, a man who minded his business. He left early in the mornings, returned in the evenings, and nodded politely while taking out the trash. He played with his children in the yard, drove them to school, and never raised suspicion. The quiet father figure presented to the neighborhood was worlds apart from the other life he kept hidden, a life of calculated violence that would one day earn him the name the Iceman. Kuklinski's path to violence began long before adulthood. A childhood marked by abuse carved something cold inside him. Fear became something he learned to control, then manipulate. He grew fascinated with the mechanics of harm: knives, firearms, improvised weapons. What started as curiosity hardened into something darker. By his teenage years, he was already experimenting with violence in ways others rarely understood or noticed. As an adult, Kuklinski sharpened those instincts. He entered circles where brutality was currency: criminal networks, gang operations, illicit deals. He worked quietly, efficiently, never boasting, never drawing attention. Those who hired him respected his silence. Those who crossed him rarely got the chance to regret it. He became a figure who could operate in shadows, providing what others wanted while revealing nothing of himself. His victims came from all corners of life: drug dealers who owed debts, criminal partners who stirred conflict, strangers who encountered him at the wrong moment. Some crossed him directly, others were targeted for profit or precaution. Kuklinski's approach remained constant: study, assess, eliminate risk. He watched how people moved, who they met when they were alone. He memorized patterns: the walk to the car, the nightly stop at a diner, the time a hallway went dark. When the opportunity matched his criteria, he acted with startling decisiveness. The nickname Iceman came from a single tactic, but it symbolized the larger truth about him. He froze bodies to delay decomposition, confusing medical examiners about the true time of death. He understood forensic gaps long before they became common knowledge. He altered crime scenes with deliberate care, removed trace evidence, and occasionally staged events to resemble accidents. Many cases that crossed his path never connected back to him because he left so little behind. His life at home remained strikingly ordinary. He worked factory jobs, clocking in and out like everyone else. He spent evenings with his wife and children, eating dinner, watching television, planning weekend trips. There were gifts, photos, holiday traditions, all of it creating a portrait of stability. To outsiders, nothing seemed amiss. His temper, when it surfaced, was explained away as stress or exhaustion. The full picture of his darkness stayed locked behind his exterior of suburban routine. Kuklinski's methods were as varied as his motivations. Sometimes he used firearms at close range. Other times, knives or blunt objects. He was known to experiment with poisons, testing reactions, adjusting dosages, and observing the effects with unnerving calm. Victims were left in alleys, buried in wooded areas, abandoned in cars, or submerged in rivers. Each scene carried different clues, different signatures, making a single pattern nearly impossible for investigators to detect. For decades, law enforcement struggled with isolated puzzles that never quite connected. A body found in one county bore no recognizable link to another found miles away. Gangs suspected internal disputes. Police suspected drug rivalries. Few imagined a single individual was responsible for so many disparate cases. Kuklinski's ability to compartmentalize, to shift seamlessly between family life and calculated violence, allowed him to evade attention for far longer than most killers. The end came in 1986, after a carefully organized sting operation. Undercover investigators gained his trust, recorded conversations, secured evidence, and gathered confessions that pulled back the curtain. When officers finally moved in, they arrested him in a parking lot, catching him off guard for the first time in years. In custody, Kuklinski remained calm, his voice steady, his stories precise. He recounted killings with minute detail, the tools he used, the locations chosen, the way he disposed of bodies. The trial that followed drew intense attention. Prosecutors laid out a complex web of violence, connecting threads long considered separate. Journalists crowded the courtroom, documenting every admission. Exhibits showed weapons, timelines, and methods, each one a window into his practical understanding of human behavior and forensic blind spots. His interviews, later made public, revealed a man who could discuss murder with an unsettling lack of emotion. What made the case particularly disturbing was the contrast itself. His life presented two sides that seemed incapable of coexisting. A father who ate breakfast with his children and a man who could kill without hesitation on his way home. The line between ordinary and monstrous blurred into something almost invisible. Today, the streets he once walked continue unchanged. Quiet neighborhoods, riverfront warehouses, small businesses closing late at night. The houses look the same. The neighborhoods still feel familiar. Yet the history beneath them holds shadows of his movements. Parking lots where deals were made. Forest edges where bodies were abandoned. Factory break rooms where he planned his next move between shifts. Richard Kuklinski drifted through these spaces with practiced invisibility. His life was a study in silence, deception, and calculation. A man who hid extraordinary violence behind the most ordinary facade. And in those dark corners of New Jersey, traces of his story remain, faint but undeniable, woven into the landscape he once moved through like a ghost. Up next is the story of Dr. Michael Mastromarino. Some crimes unfold in hospitals, some in quiet neighborhoods, and some in offices that appear entirely ordinary. This is the story of Dr. Michael Mastromarino, a dentist who traded drills and dental chairs for refrigeration units and hidden freezers, turning human remains into a black market commodity and exploiting trust in the most personal of ways, the treatment of the dead. New Jersey in the early 2000s seemed like any other region in America. Suburban streets, medical offices on corner lots, families living out ordinary routines. It was in this environment, amid trust in medical professionals and quiet neighborhoods, that Michael Mastromarino began a practice few could have imagined. By day, he was a licensed dentist running a modest office where patients came for cleanings, fillings, and routine oral care. But beneath the professional veneer lay a network of illegal activity that would shock the nation. Mastromarino's operation did not begin with sudden malice. According to his own admissions, it started with opportunity and ambition. He partnered with a small funeral home to harvest bone, tissue, and organs from cadavers before the families knew. He manipulated consent forms, sometimes obtaining signatures after death, other times convincing families that donation was part of standard postmortem procedures. His pitch was plausible. Tissue would be used for research, for life-saving transplants, for advancing medicine. Few questioned it. The mechanics of the operation were precise. Bodies arrived at the dental office, unassuming and unguarded, stored in refrigerators that looked like ordinary commercial units. Staff, sometimes employees unaware of the legality, sometimes complicit, assisted in the processing, separating bones, tendons, and tissue. Mastromarino would then sell the harvested parts to tissue companies across the United States, generating profits far exceeding legitimate dental practice income. The first signs of impropriety emerged not from law enforcement, but from the families of the deceased. Relatives began noticing inconsistencies. missing body parts, unexplained incisions, cremations that revealed bones absent or incomplete. Funeral directors noticed irregularities in deliveries and transport logs. Complaints trickled in sporadically, but without direct evidence of wrongdoing, investigations stalled. Mastro Marino's charm and professional status shielded him. He was personable, courteous, and persuasive, qualities that disguised illicit intent. Over time, the scale of the operation expanded. Mastro Marino established contracts with medical schools, research facilities, and tissue processors, all eager to acquire bone and tissue without always verifying consent. In his own recounting, he believed he was operating in a gray area, a blurred intersection of legality, demand, and opportunity. But by 2003, evidence suggested a more disturbing truth. Some body parts had been harvested without any consent whatsoever. Families, expecting a complete burial or cremation, discovered violations that could not be undone. Investigators began to trace the trail of violations, uncovering the full scope of the scheme. Documentation showed repeated manipulation of consent forms, fraudulent records, and consistent misrepresentation of the purpose for which tissues were being used. Autopsies confirmed missing bone, tendons, and tissue in bodies that had been entrusted to Mastro Marino's care. The physical evidence, once collected, painted a grim picture. Dozens of victims, all post-mortem, all exploited, all with families deceived in the most intimate way possible. The arrest came in 2005, after authorities received corroborated complaints from multiple funeral homes and families. Mastro Marino did not resist. Interviews revealed a man capable of rationalizing his actions. He spoke of entrepreneurship, of supplying medical research, of meeting demand. Yet he also admitted to knowing the violations of law he had committed. When pressed about the consent of families, he offered a mixture of evasions and half-truths, reflecting a man aware of the moral consequences, but calculating enough to minimize them. The trial that followed captivated the public. Media coverage detailed the mechanics of the operation, the disturbing casualness with which human remains had been treated, and the exploitation of trust in a domain typically immune to suspicion. Mastro Marino's defense argued for misunderstanding and oversight, attempting to portray him as a businessman navigating poorly defined regulations. Prosecutors highlighted the deliberate nature of the fraud, the disregard for consent, and the psychological impact on families who discovered their loved ones had been violated in death. By the conclusion of the proceedings, Mastro Marino was sentenced to 38 years in federal prison. His co-conspirators, including employees of the funeral homes and tissue processing companies, also received sentences ranging from probation to several years of imprisonment. The case prompted sweeping reforms in the regulation of tissue donation and medical ethics oversight. Consent procedures were tightened, auditing systems implemented, and criminal liability for illicit harvesting clearly established. Yet the human dimension of the case remained haunting. Families recounted the profound violation they felt, seeing their loved one's body returned incomplete, discovering that tissues meant for sacred repose had been commodified, recognizing that trust had been exploited in the most intimate of circumstances. Funeral directors and medical professionals spoke of shock, disbelief, and a lingering fear of malpractice hidden behind legitimate-seeming practice. Mastro Marino's operation was calculated, meticulous, and sustained over years. It was not violent in the traditional sense. There were no chases, no weapons, no physical assault. Yet the harm was profound, emotional, psychological, and spiritual. It demonstrated how professional authority, when corrupted, can create a network of exploitation invisible to the casual observer. Trust, in this case, was weaponized, and the most sacred moment, death, was transformed into an avenue for profit. Even today, the story lingers in medical and dental circles as a cautionary tale. It reminds practitioners of the profound responsibility that comes with access to human bodies, living or deceased. It reminds regulators that vigilance, audits, and consent verification are not mere formalities, but essential safeguards. and it reminds the public that even those who present themselves as healers can sometimes operate in ways that betray trust with devastating consequences. Mastro Marino's legacy is paradoxical. On the one hand, regulatory reforms protect the living and the dead. On the other hand, the lives already affected cannot be undone. Families continue to recount the shock of discovering that someone they trusted with the remains of a loved one had profited in violation of ethics, law, and humanity. The sanitized offices, the sterile equipment, the refrigerated freezers, once symbols of professional care, now evoke a cold reminder of how easily human dignity can be exploited when oversight fails. Next story takes us to Los Angeles. It's about a certain angel of death. In the bustling corridors of a Los Angeles hospital, the constant rhythm of beeping monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes created a sense of predictability. Patients were admitted, treated, and discharged, and for the most part, life continued without incident. But in the late 1990s, one man quietly turned these halls into a place of fear, suspicion, and death. Efren Saldivar was a respiratory therapist, a professional entrusted with the care of patients who relied on him for the very air that kept them alive. On the surface, Saldivar appeared dedicated, calm, and empathetic. Families praised his attentiveness. Colleagues described him as precise and competent. But underneath that facade, a chilling reality was taking shape. Saldivar's method was subtle, almost invisible. Patients did not scream. They did not fight. They simply became weaker, their bodies failing under his careful supervision. Using potent doses of muscle relaxants and other medications intended to sedate patients, he could accelerate death in ways that initially seemed consistent with natural causes. In hospitals, where death is not uncommon, such tragedies often went unremarked upon. For years, Saldivar's actions went unnoticed. Death certificates listed natural causes, and the hospital administration did not raise alarms. But patterns began to emerge as certain patients consistently died under his care. Nurses started noticing subtle irregularities, medications administered in unusual sequences, vital signs dropping unexpectedly, and a higher than expected mortality rate among patients assigned to him. The first whisper of suspicion came not from outside investigators, but from within the hospital itself. A colleague mentioned an unusual cluster of deaths to administration, prompting a careful review of medical records. As files were scrutinized, a disturbing pattern emerged. Patients who were vulnerable, often elderly or critically ill, had died following doses of medication that, while legally prescribed, were clearly being manipulated to hasten their demise. Saldivar's motives were complex and chilling. Interviews and investigations revealed a man who took pride in his control over life and death, someone who saw himself as a necessary arbiter. In his own twisted perspective, he described ending suffering, a claim that would haunt investigators and families alike. But the truth was far darker. Dozens of patients had their lives prematurely ended, victims whose only crime was being under the care of a man who enjoyed the hidden power he wielded. The investigation revealed that Saldivar may have killed as many as 50 patients over several years. Each act was calculated, each death executed with precision. Toxicology reports, unusual medication logs, and interviews with colleagues gradually painted a picture of a man who transformed the hospital into a theater of death, hidden under the guise of caregiving. The trial was intense and methodical. Saldivar initially denied wrongdoing, claiming his actions were therapeutic, intended to alleviate suffering. But evidence was overwhelming. Patient charts, medication discrepancies, and witness testimony created an unassailable case. Families who had once trusted him were forced to confront a horrifying truth. Their loved ones had been victims of a deliberate killing, executed by the very person meant to keep them alive. Expert witnesses described the physiology of Saldivar's victims. Muscle relaxants, administered inappropriately, caused respiratory failure. Patients' lungs would stop working, the heart would slow, and the body would quietly succumb. There were no signs of struggle, No dramatic confrontations, just a steady, unobserved decline that left families bewildered and grieving. In the courtroom, the psychological portrait of Saldivar emerged as almost clinical in its detachment. He meticulously planned each act, ensuring that deaths could be attributed to natural causes. Colleagues described him as charming and composed, a man who could navigate both the technical aspects of patient care and the social expectations of his role. Yet behind the smiles and calm demeanor, there was a calculating mind, willing to exploit trust for his own grim satisfaction. The public reaction was a mix of disbelief and horror. Hospitals are meant to be sanctuaries, places where the ill are cared for, where human life is respected and protected. To learn that a caregiver had weaponized his knowledge against patients shook not only Los Angeles, but the broader medical community. Ethical debates ensued. How could a system detect and prevent someone with the skill to hide murder within routine care? How many lives were lost before suspicion ever arose? Eventually, Saldivar confessed, though inconsistently, to several of the killings. His confessions helped bring closure to some families, but the sheer scale of his actions made it impossible to quantify the emotional damage. For the victims, there was no recovery. For their loved ones, only the haunting certainty that death had come not from nature, but from human hands. Sentencing reflected the gravity of his crimes. Saldivar received multiple life sentences, ensuring he would never have the opportunity to harm again. The hospital implemented stricter oversight, auditing protocols, and systemic checks to prevent a recurrence. Yet, despite reforms, the memory of the angel of death lingered, a chilling reminder of the vulnerabilities inherent in care-based professions. The story of Efren Saldivar resonates because of its quiet horror. There were no dramatic chases, no headlines screaming immediate danger. Instead, there was the slow, methodical extinguishing of life, hidden within the ordinary rhythm of hospital routines. Patients trusted him, families believed in his care, and that trust, once broken, amplified the terror of his actions. Walking the corridors of modern hospitals, one might notice the subtle diligence of staff, the quiet hum of machines, the faint antiseptic smell that permeates the air. It is a world of vigilance, of life preserved. But the shadow of the past lingers. The story of Efren Saldivar reminds us that evil can sometimes reside not in overt chaos, but in the calm, controlled hands of those we trust most. Even today, his name evokes unease within the medical community. For nurses, doctors, and families alike, it is a cautionary tale of vigilance, of skepticism, and of the terrible consequences when someone abuses the power granted to them by faith and necessity. It is a story that does not end with a sudden revelation or dramatic confrontation, but in the lingering memories of the lives lost, the quiet grief of families, and the uneasy awareness that sometimes the most dangerous threats are those hidden behind a smile and a calm demeanor. Next up is the case of the Cleveland torso murders. The city in the 1930s wore the exhaustion of the Great Depression like a second skin. Factories clanged along the riverfront, their smoke thick and choking. Streets were crowded with men and women searching for work, for food, for hope. Streetcars rattled across steel tracks. Gas lamps flickered in alleys that smelled of coal, sweat, and decay. It was into this city, one of hardship and shadow, that a predator arrived. One who would earn a name that still chills the spine, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The first victims appeared quietly, discovered by neighbors or city workers. They were usually poor, drifters, sometimes prostitutes, always people whom society could afford to lose. In Kingsbury Run, a rough patch of woodlands and scrub on the city's east side, bodies were found scattered like discarded dolls. Limbs severed, torsos missing, heads gone. The killings were grotesque, surgical in some ways, careless in others. Detectives were baffled. The police force at the time was overworked, stretched thin by the city's economic pressures. Patrols were minimal in the poorer districts. Coroners were busy with industrial accidents and the daily toll of poverty. Each discovery of a body sparked fear, outrage, and yet frustration. no one could connect the pieces. The Mad Butcher moved with precision and invisibility. Victims were dismembered with a kind of efficiency that suggested knowledge of anatomy. Some were decapitated cleanly. Others were hacked, thrown carelessly into the underbrush. Clothes were often removed. Sometimes belongings were missing. Other times, bodies were positioned unnaturally, arranged almost deliberately. A pattern slowly emerged. The victims were almost exclusively local women. Most had tenuous connections to the city, jobs in bars or factories, transit lives. Their absence often went unreported for days. By the time detectives discovered a corpse, decomposition had set in. Identification was difficult, slow, imperfect. Public fear intensified with each new discovery. Kingsbury Run became a place of dread. Children were warned not to stray too far from home. Women traveled in groups at night. Neighbors peered out windows, listening for the rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a street cat. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered of ritual, of madness, of revenge. Others simply said the city itself had grown too harsh, too hungry, too cruel, and that some men were capable of anything. The first major case officially linked to the killer involved a young woman named Anna Lloyd. Her torso was found near the river, partially submerged. Limbs were missing. The head had been removed. The coroner noted careful slicing at the joints. Someone knew where to cut. The sight of her dismembered body horrified the neighborhood, but also sparked a renewed effort from police. Detective Elliot Ness, already gaining notoriety for his Prohibition-era work against gangsters, was assigned to the case. Ness, methodical and dogged, approached the killings like a puzzle, a grim labyrinth he could not allow himself to ignore. He coordinated search parties in Kingsbury Run, interviewed vagrants, questioned barmaids and bartenders, traced the comings and goings of residents. Each lead seemed to vanish into thin air. The killer escalated. More victims appeared, sometimes in public spaces, sometimes hidden behind abandoned buildings or railroad tracks. The level of dismemberment varied. Sometimes the body was neatly chopped, sometimes limbs were thrown randomly, leaving investigators to reconstruct events from horrific fragments. Police theorized that the killer might be local, familiar with the city's geography, capable of navigating alleys and industrial areas without drawing attention. By the late 1930s, Cleveland had a media frenzy. Newspapers ran headlines in bold type. Mad Butcher terrorizes Cleveland. Bodies found in Kingsbury Run. Is Cleveland safe? Readers devoured each story. Horror and morbid fascination entwined. Editorials called for curfews. Civic leaders demanded action. The fear was palpable. The killer thrived in the anxiety he inspired. Victims were often anonymous. Many were identified only through clothing or personal effects, sometimes only months after discovery. Others remained nameless. The anonymity heightened the terror. Anyone could vanish without a trace. Families were uncertain. Friends whispered about missing neighbors. Strangers feared crossing paths with the unseen predator. Attempts to apprehend the Mad Butcher were frustrated by multiple factors. The killer was clever, patient, and mobile. Some believed he had medical or surgical knowledge. Others thought he was a vagrant, familiar with the outskirts of the city, able to disappear into the shadows. Ness considered every possibility, from organized criminal activity to a single lunatic with anatomical skill. One of the most chilling aspects was the randomness. Victims were not robbed. Their deaths had no clear motive. There was no discernible pattern of grudges or revenge. Some theorized a ritualistic aspect, but no evidence confirmed it. The horror lay in unpredictability. The city could never feel safe. A woman walking home from work, a man returning to a boarding house. Anyone could be next. The killings peaked in 1938. A new discovery shocked even veteran officers. Frances Brown, a factory worker, found partially decomposed near a derelict building. Her torso was removed. Closer inspection revealed crude but deliberate incisions at major joints. The brutality suggested frustration and rage, but the precision suggested knowledge. Some limbs were missing entirely, possibly disposed of elsewhere. Investigators searched for leads across the city, but came up empty-handed. The public demanded action. Citizens organized patrols. Church groups held vigils. Families stopped letting children roam freely. Still, the killer struck again. The fear was compounded by helplessness. People knew that law enforcement was trying, that detectives like Ness were relentless, but no one had an answer. Eventually, police identified a suspect, a man named Richard Cottingham, a local with a history of violence and mental instability. He was detained, questioned extensively, and released. Evidence was circumstantial at best. Cottingham's name faded from official reports, but it revealed just how elusive the true killer was. Detectives turned to forensic evidence, what little they had. Fingerprints were few. Blood analysis was primitive. Photography captured fragments of the crime scenes. Sketches were made. Even so, each body discovered in Kingsbury Run remained a challenge, a testament to the killer's cunning. Speculation flourished. Was the Mad Butcher a man driven by sexual compulsion? A psychotic who found joy in terror? Or someone methodical who studied anatomy and death as a craft? The truth was never fully known. Ness never identified a final suspect. Some bodies were never linked to a killer at all. The Mad Butcher left behind a trail of bodies and unanswered questions. By 1939, the killing slowed. Whether the killer moved away, died, or simply stopped is unclear. The city exhaled slowly but never entirely. Residents still whispered about Kingsbury Run. Mothers warned daughters. Men hesitated before walking alone at night. The fear never fully dissipated. Cleveland had been marked, forever altered by an unseen hand. The Mad Butcher remains unidentified. The city moves on. Streets are paved over. Buildings rise where brush and scrub once hid horror. Yet Kingsbury Run and its dark history are not forgotten. Its shadows linger in the corners of memory, in the way people talk about places they do not go, in the uneasy silence after a late-night stroll. Now, let's talk about Burke and Hare, the Edinburgh body snatchers. Edinburgh in the 1820s was a city of cobblestones, gas lamps, and a low hum of commerce. Narrow closes led to hidden courtyards. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the stench of peat, sweat, and soot. At night, the city seemed alive and secret, a place where shadows could move undisturbed. In the old town, along Potter Row and the Grass Market, a peculiar fear began to take hold. It was subtle at first, whispered among students of anatomy at the University of Edinburgh, murmured by tavern patrons, and finally spoken outright in the crowded, dimly lit streets. Bodies were disappearing. At first, no one understood the scale of what was happening. Graves were found disturbed. Coffins were empty. Curiosity mingled with outrage. But medical students, particularly those studying anatomy for the new and ambitious medical programs, were quick to see opportunity in this chaos. The demand for cadavers was high. Legal supply was meager. Anatomy professors could pay for bodies, but the law restricted their sources. And so the shadows provided a solution. Two men, William Burke and William Hare, became central to this grim trade. They were Irish immigrants, operating on the margins of society, scraping by as laborers and petty criminals. Burke was tall, with a commanding presence. Hare was shorter, wiry, nervous, but cunning. Together, they discovered a market that would sustain them, and a method that would defy belief. It began with the dead. The pair supplied Edinburgh's medical schools with corpses for dissection. Initially, these were bodies from hospitals, from workhouses, sometimes from paupers who had died naturally. They would transport them to anatomy professors for profit. It was profitable, but the risk was substantial. The city was small, neighbors watched each other, and rumors spread quickly. But money bred greed, and greed bred audacity. Burke and Hare discovered that the living could be made to supply the dead. They realized a horrifying truth. Murder could be profitable. If a person were killed and supplied to the medical school, the financial rewards far exceeded the meager wages of honest work. And thus, the killings began. The first victims were vulnerable. Lodgers in Hare's boarding house, people with no family nearby, travelers, the elderly, the sick. They were strangers in Edinburgh, easy to lure, easier to dispose of. Hare would often entice them with lodging and drink. Burke provided the physical strength necessary to carry out the acts. Their method became known as burking. It was efficient, cruelly simple, and almost surgical in execution. Victims were held down, pressure applied to the chest and throat until they suffocated. There was no struggle, no external wound. The body remained intact for the anatomy professors, who were the ultimate customers. In their eyes, the men were providing a service. The first known victim was Margaret Docherty, an elderly woman lodging with Hare. She trusted the men. She drank with them, accepted the bed they offered, and slept unaware of the danger. The next morning, she was gone. Her body was delivered to Professor Robert Knox, a respected anatomist at the University of Edinburgh. Knox paid handsomely. The killings continued with frightening regularity. James Wilson, a middle-aged man, and Mary Patterson, a young woman, followed in quick succession. The men adapted, refining their techniques. Each murder was methodical. They kept meticulous records of who had been supplied and who remained unaccounted for. Their profits mounted. The men were emboldened. The city remained largely unaware. Few noticed missing persons among the poor and transient populations. Families were too impoverished to mount complaints, and social indifference was strong. Burke and Hare operated in the shadows, yet always near the bustling heart of Edinburgh. Their boarding house became a hub for the macabre trade. Visitors would sometimes comment on odd smells, a strange smell of decay, but they dismissed it as illness or garbage. Eventually, confidence gave way to recklessness. One night, in Hare's own lodging house, they encountered Marion Brown, a young lodger. She was argumentative, skeptical of the men, and refused to cooperate when enticed with drink and promises. Burke's temper flared. The methodical process they had perfected turned brutal. Marion was held down, suffocated quickly, and transported to Knox's anatomy rooms. As her body count rose, suspicion began to grow. In 1828, a lodger named Margaret Daft Jamie Docherty arrived and vanished, prompting inquiries from neighbors and local authorities. Rumors circulated of estranged men and their supposed supply of bodies. Authorities began to investigate. The downfall came with Margaret Docherty's death. Ironically, unlike earlier victims, her disappearance was noticed. Witnesses spoke. Evidence emerged. Burke and Hare were arrested, but not immediately for murder. They were initially charged with illegally handling corpses. The investigation quickly unearthed the scale of the killings. During interrogation, Hare confessed to multiple murders, hoping for leniency. He implicated Burke as the mastermind. The courts moved quickly. Hare was promised immunity in exchange for testimony against Burke. The trial gripped Edinburgh. Every detail, every body, every witness testimony fed into a spectacle that the city could not turn away from. Burke remained calm, almost theatrical, throughout the proceedings. He denied all accusations. Witnesses spoke of his towering presence, the coldness in his gaze, the calculated way he had lured victims. Details of the burking process horrified jurors and spectators alike. Families of victims attended, silent, their grief hidden beneath the formal decorum of the courtroom. The trial concluded with a swift verdict. Burke was found guilty of murder. The sentence, hanging. The public flocked to witness the execution. On the scaffold, Burke maintained his composure. Some said he smiled. Others said he muttered curses under his breath. His death was meant to close the chapter, but the legend of Burke and Hare would endure far longer than the men themselves. Hare, by contrast, was spared execution. He lived out his days in hiding, moving from town to town, but never fully escaping the infamy that followed him. Newspapers continued to recount the murders. The details of their crimes, suffocation, delivery to anatomy professors, the callous disregard for life, fascinated and horrified generations. The anatomy professors, including Robert Knox, were not charged, though their role raised ethical questions that lingered in Edinburgh's history. They had purchased bodies, paid handsomely, and remained largely insulated from public scrutiny. Knox himself remained a figure of controversy, respected academically, but forever shadowed by association with the murders. The legacy of Burke and Hare is a chilling reminder of human greed, desperation, and cruelty. In a city that was already dense with history, cobblestones, and narrow alleys, two men had exploited the vulnerable, turning death into a business. Kings, queens, and the rich slept safely. The poor were caught in the crosshairs of two men who knew that society's blind spots could hide anything. The boarding house itself no longer exists. Time and redevelopment erased the physical structure, but history preserves its memory. Burke and Hare are remembered not only as murderers, but as architects of a system where legality, profit, and morality collided in horrifying ways. Their story lingers in the air of Edinburgh, a city that never forgets when two men manipulated death itself for gain. Next up is the case of Dr. Anthony Garcia. Long hours, sleepless nights, and the constant hum of monitors shape a reality where mistakes can be fatal. Within this world, Dr. Anthony Garcia, a physician in training in the United States, transformed frustration and resentment into lethal intent, turning the very hospital wards meant for learning and healing into arenas of calculated danger. Anthony Garcia entered residency with ambition. Colleagues described him as talented but volatile, someone who thrived under pressure, yet carried a simmering resentment toward those he felt had slighted him. Attending physicians who were critical, peers who overshadowed him, or nurses who questioned his judgment. That resentment gradually metastasized, evolving from irritation into a compulsion that would have devastating consequences. The first suspicious incidents were subtle. Patients under Garcia's care sometimes experienced unexpected complications. Medication schedules were disrupted, intravenous lines tampered with, and ventilator settings adjusted improperly. Initially, supervisors attributed these anomalies to fatigue, inexperience, or the chaotic environment of the hospital. Residency programs, already stretched thin, assumed occasional errors were inevitable and quickly forgotten. But patterns emerged. Certain attending physicians who had been critical of Garcia noticed unexplained deterioration in their patients. Colleagues who had raised minor objections found themselves on shifts coinciding with adverse outcomes. Data analysis revealed that patient complications disproportionately occurred when Garcia was directly responsible for care or had influence over treatment plans. One case involved a middle-aged patient recovering from a routine appendectomy. The patient had been stable for 2 days, showing steady improvement. Garcia, assigned to oversee post-operative care, adjusted medication dosages without documented authorization. Within hours, the patient's vital signs plummeted, leading to cardiac arrest. Colleagues performed resuscitation, but the event left investigators puzzled until medication logs revealed unauthorized adjustments. Another series of incidents involved patients whose families later noticed inconsistencies in care. Nurses reported that Garcia would override instructions, delay treatments, or administer drugs outside of prescribed protocols. Each action, individually, could be dismissed as a clerical or procedural error. Together, however, they formed a pattern of deliberate interference that ultimately endangered, and in some cases ended, the lives of vulnerable patients. Hospital administration began to piece together the timeline. Audits of patient outcomes, medication records, and shift schedules revealed that complications were concentrated around Garcia's rotations. Interviews with staff uncovered reports of intimidation, unexplained decisions, and a tense working environment. The full scope was horrifying. Dozens of incidents across multiple wards that could no longer be attributed to coincidence. Legal proceedings followed, drawing attention to the unique environment of residency training. Garcia's access to patients, combined with authority over junior staff and confidence in his medical skill, allowed him to manipulate care in ways that went undetected for months. Forensic investigations confirmed that several patients' deteriorations were directly linked to his actions. In some cases, improperly administered medications, or delayed interventions had resulted in preventable deaths. Testimonies painted a picture of a professional environment disrupted by subtle sabotage. Staff described monitoring shifts with heightened anxiety, knowing that errors were not random, but could be linked to a single individual's decisions. Families recounted sudden declines, confusion, and the emotional strain of witnessing loved ones worsen inexplicably. Garcia was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of manslaughter and criminal negligence. The trial detailed the methods, timing, and consequences of his actions, revealing the extent to which a single resident could manipulate patient care for personal motives. Sentencing reflected the gravity of the offenses and the betrayal of trust inherent in targeting colleagues' patients, including those who had relied entirely on his oversight for survival. The case also exposed systemic weaknesses, the challenge of detecting deliberate harm in environments designed for rapid decision-making, the vulnerabilities inherent in hierarchical medical systems, and the potential consequences when personal vendettas intersect with access to vulnerable patients. Hospital protocols, audit mechanisms, and supervision policies were scrutinized as a result, ensuring that unauthorized interventions could be traced more effectively in the future. Even within the residency program itself, Garcia's actions left an enduring mark. Staff members who had witnessed his manipulation spoke of heightened awareness and ongoing concern for patient safety. Colleagues who had once been unsure of their suspicions realized, retrospectively, that the pattern of harm had been deliberate, not coincidental. Walking through the wards where these events occurred, the memory of the patients lost under Garcia's oversight remains palpable. Charts, monitors, and ventilators, symbols of healing, also carry the weight of what happens when authority, resentment, and medical knowledge intersect with fatal consequences. Patients entrusted to his care became instruments in a personal vendetta, illustrating that danger in hospitals is not always external, but can emerge from within, cloaked in professional authority and the assumed competence of a physician. Next story, Mary and Cotton, England's deadly nurse. Northeast England, mid-19th century. The industrial towns of Durham and Sunderland were thick with smoke, the air heavy with coal dust. Narrow streets wound between brick terraces, and the hum of daily labor filled the streets. Factories belched clouds into the sky, while families struggled to make ends meet. In this harsh landscape of soot and work, ordinary lives moved in routine. Work, home, church, yet behind doors, shadows often hid. Marion Cotton was born in 1832 in a mining community near Durham. She grew up familiar with hardship, loss, and illness. Childhood for Mary and was framed by the rhythm of labor and the specter of death, diseases that swept quickly through crowded homes, claiming children and adults alike. By her late teens, she had learned to care for the sick, navigate the local social networks, and manage households. But she also developed an understanding of the dark opportunities death could provide. Mary married young. Her first husband, a man who worked in the mines. He fell ill, and not long after, he died. She received a life insurance payout. Soon after, a series of husbands, lovers, and children succumbed to illness under her watch. At first, it seemed coincidental, tragic, yet natural. Cholera, tuberculosis, and fever were rampant. Yet patterns began to emerge. Families noticed that deaths clustered around her, that life insurance policies often followed closely behind. Whispers began in the community, the kind of gossip that travels quietly along cobbled streets. By the 1860s, Mary had married several times. Each husband, each child in her care, seemed to die unexpectedly. Neighbors started to connect the dots. The frequency of deaths, the consistency of her presence, and the financial benefits she received. Yet suspicion was subtle, diffused by grief and the inevitability of disease in a crowded industrial town. Death was common. A miner's cough could be fatal. Children's immune systems were weak. Illnesses ran rampant. In that environment, an untimely death could seem normal. Marian's methods were methodical. She used arsenic, a substance readily available in the 19th century for pest control and medicinal purposes. Administered in small, controlled doses, it could mimic natural illness, fever, vomiting, abdominal pain. Doctors of the era often misdiagnosed symptoms, attributing sudden deaths to cholera, typhoid, or consumption. Mary exploited these gaps in knowledge, ensuring her acts remained invisible, buried beneath layers of plausible explanation. Communities were oblivious for years. She moved from town to town, taking on new husbands and households, continuing her deadly pattern. Reports circulated of women who cared for sick relatives, but whose families always seemed to die in succession. Yet proving intent, collecting evidence, and attributing deaths to one person was nearly impossible in the 19th century. Mary Ann's intelligence, charm, and social skill shielded her. She presented herself as devoted, competent, and pious, a woman performing her domestic duty in the harshest of environments. The turning point came in 1879. Investigators noticed a string of suspicious deaths, all linked by proximity, insurance, and Mary Ann's presence. Advances in forensic science, particularly in chemical analysis, allowed authorities to detect arsenic post-mortem. Exhumations of her victims revealed the unmistakable poison. The pattern of death could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or natural misfortune. Mary Ann was arrested, charged with multiple counts of murder, and her case became a national sensation. Trial proceedings captivated the public. Mary Ann, middle-aged, frail in appearance, faced a courtroom filled with grim spectators, curious journalists, and shocked families. The prosecution outlined the deaths, the evidence of arsenic, and the financial motive. Witnesses recounted suspicious circumstances, odd behaviors, and a sheer frequency of fatalities in her households. The courtroom was tense, every statement building a portrait of methodical cruelty hidden beneath a veneer of domesticity. Mary Ann defended herself with composure. She claimed innocence, attributing deaths to illness, misfortune, and natural causes. Yet the evidence was compelling. Consistent patterns of arsenic poisoning, financial gain from life insurance, and the accumulation of tragedy wherever she resided. Jurors deliberated amid public scrutiny, weighing the plausibility of coincidental deaths against overwhelming circumstantial and scientific evidence. Ultimately, Mary Ann Cotton was convicted of the murder of her stepson, Charlie Cotton, although suspicions extended to dozens of deaths over decades. She was sentenced to death and executed in 1888. Her case shocked England, drawing attention to domestic homicide, the use of poison, and the vulnerabilities inherent in Victorian households. The legacy of Mary Ann Cotton endures because of the intersection of social conditions, gender expectations, and criminal ingenuity. She exploited the norms of domestic responsibility, the trust placed in women as caregivers, and the limitations of contemporary medicine. Her acts were calculated, methodical, and hidden behind the routines of everyday life. Meals prepared, fires stoked, children cared for, all disguising lethal intent. Beyond the immediate horror, the case highlights societal vulnerability. Families relied on domestic women for care, comfort, and moral guidance. Mary Ann's actions exploited that trust, demonstrating that danger can arise in intimate, private spaces. It also underscores the evolution of criminal investigation. The development of chemical analysis, exhumation protocols, and forensic oversight were directly influenced by cases like hers. Mary Ann's story is a window into a world where ordinary life and extraordinary cruelty intersect. Coal-stained streets, smoke-filled rooms, and bustling industrial towns created a backdrop for both survival and violence. Death was an accepted part of daily life. Yet within that ordinary rhythm, one individual's cunning turned inevitability into exploitation. The impact of Mary Ann Cotton reaches beyond historical curiosity. Authors, historians, and criminologists study her case as an early example of serial poisoning, female-perpetrated homicide, and the manipulation of domestic trust. Every detail, the selection of victims, the methods, the careful avoidance of suspicion, is analyzed for insight into human behavior, social conditions, and criminal psychology. Unlike cases with sudden, spectacular violence, Marianne's murders were subtle, creeping, almost invisible. Death arrived under the guise of normalcy, and each fatality reinforced the illusion. Her ability to navigate social systems, exploit ignorance, and manipulate perception makes her story both terrifying and fascinating. In the industrial towns of northeast England, the memory of Marianne Cotton remains a cautionary tale, a study in the extremes of domestic crime, and a reminder that opportunity for evil often hides behind ordinary routines. Her life, death, and the crimes she committed continue to challenge assumptions about trust, gender, and the limits of detection. Next story, Liverpool Black Widows, Murder and Mystery in Victorian England. Liverpool, 1880s. The docks were alive with the smell of salt water, coal smoke, and tar. Ships groaned as ropes were hauled, and seagulls circled above the warehouses. In the narrow streets behind the bustling port, tenements rose like brick walls, windows glowing faintly with candlelight. Inside these homes, lives unfolded quietly, but some of them hid dark intentions. Amelia Satch and Annie Chapman, later dubbed the Liverpool Black Widows by local newspapers, lived ordinary lives at first glance. They were married women, neighbors, and friends in their working-class districts. Amelia was quiet but shrewd, observant in her gestures and conversations. Annie had a sharper, more impulsive edge, her voice carrying across rooms, even when she tried to appear demure. Together, they formed a pair whose domestic facade concealed something far more sinister. It began with a series of deaths that, to neighbors, seemed coincidental. Husbands fell ill after meals, complaining of stomach pain, nausea, and headaches. At first, friends and family assumed natural causes, poor diet, overwork, or weak constitutions. But the pace of deaths, always linked to meals shared in these households, drew whispers. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Investigators later documented the pattern. Men, mostly middle-aged, sometimes infirm, visited the women or lived under their roofs. Shortly afterward, their health deteriorated rapidly. Meals prepared with care, powders added to coffee, bottles of tonic delivered with attention. Each detail seemingly ordinary, but each fatal. Poison was suspected. Arsenic, easy to acquire and difficult to detect in food, became the likely culprit. The first documented death attributed to the pair occurred in 1884. A man named James Smith, a lodger of Annie Chapman, complained of stomach cramps and fever. Neighbors described Annie attending to him attentively, offering tea, medicine, and reassurance. Within days, he was dead. No one questioned her actions at the time. The death was attributed to disease. But other cases soon followed. Amelia Satch's victims were similar. Her husband, John Satch, had been ill with a lingering cough and fatigue. Amelia administered powders and potions, as she had for years. When his condition worsened suddenly, rumors began to circulate in the local community. Both women, socially unremarkable yet capable of charm and persuasion, were careful to maintain appearances. Visitors were welcomed, meals served politely, and domestic life continued undisturbed. Police investigations escalated after multiple deaths occurred within the same neighborhoods. Officials began examining household substances, comparing symptoms across cases, and questioning neighbors and relatives. Survivors reported subtle details: the bitter taste of a drink, the unusual persistence of powders in a meal, the attention paid to who consumed what and when. Evidence accumulated slowly, piecing together a pattern of deliberate administration rather than natural misfortune. Inquests revealed striking consistencies. Symptoms before death included vomiting, dizziness, and internal pain, classic signs of arsenic poisoning. Some victims had consumed meals or tonics prepared by the women in the hours preceding collapse. Witnesses recounted subtle but telling behavior. The women carefully measuring powders, double-checking doses, and observing reactions with apparent interest. While each individual action seemed innocent, the repetition created a chilling narrative. The press seized upon the story. Headlines proclaimed the Liverpool Black Widows were preying upon their husbands and acquaintances. Newspapers described the domestic scenes in vivid detail: the polished teapots, neatly arranged tables, and the quiet attentiveness that concealed lethal intent. Readers were captivated, drawn to the contrast between ordinary household routines and the extraordinary, hidden danger within them. Arrests followed. Both women were taken into custody, charged with multiple counts of murder. Police carefully collected evidence: powders, bottles, and kitchen implements. Toxicology tests confirmed arsenic in several victims. Witnesses were called to describe daily routines, interactions, and meals, painting a picture of meticulous preparation. The domestic sphere, once assumed safe, had become a stage for death. During the trial, the courtroom was filled with tension. Amelia and Annie were composed, presenting themselves as ordinary women wrongfully accused. The prosecution described the sequence of illnesses, the timing of meals, and the repeated presence of arsenic. Witnesses testified about conversations overheard, suspicious deliveries, and changes in victims' behavior. The cumulative evidence created a chilling impression of planning, repetition, and calculation. Observers were drawn to small, concrete details. A teaspoon used for a tonic became central. The smell of powders in the kitchen, faint yet persistent, was mentioned repeatedly. Notes detailing purchases of arsenic and other chemicals were scrutinized. The meticulous domestic life of these women, once a sign of care and propriety, was now inseparable from the story of death. Despite compelling evidence, the case was complex. Establishing direct intent for each death was challenging. Toxicology methods, while advanced for the time, were not infallible. Defense attorneys emphasized gaps in evidence, arguing that repeated fatalities could have been coincidence or natural disease. Yet the combination of circumstantial proof and forensic analysis created a narrative that was difficult to ignore. The verdicts were mixed. Amelia Satch was convicted on multiple counts, while Annie Chapman faced lesser charges, reflecting the variations in evidence. Sentences were handed down with severity, signaling public outrage and the extraordinary nature of the crimes. Prison terms and eventual release marked the legal conclusion, yet the events themselves retained a chilling immediacy. What made the Liverpool Black Widows case unforgettable was the scale and repetition of the crimes. Multiple men died under similar circumstances, with the women's involvement documented through meticulous observation, toxicology, and testimony. The ordinary act of preparing a meal became inseparably linked to lethal outcome. Every step, grinding powders, stirring tonics, serving coffee, now carried the weight of consequence. Liverpool itself seemed quieter after the arrests. Streets remained busy with commerce, but whispers of poisoned households lingered. Families avoided the women's neighborhoods. The story spread to nearby towns, a cautionary tale told without embellishment. A tale of repeated poisonings hidden beneath domestic civility, carried out by women whose ordinary appearances concealed extraordinary danger. The details remain shocking. Victims reported early signs of nausea, dizziness, and sudden illness. Friends described the women as charming yet calculating. Evidence tied them directly to toxic substances and repeated fatal outcomes. Every domestic action, pouring tea, handing out meals, measuring powders, became part of the historical record, precise and chilling. Next story, Wanda Stawicki, Poison, Obsession, and Murder. Warsaw, Poland, early 1990s. The city hummed with transition, a mixture of post-communist energy and lingering shadows of the past. Tram cars rattled over cobblestone streets, streetlights flickered in alleys, and shopkeepers shuttered their stores at night. In a modest apartment complex on the city's outskirts, Wanda Stawicki lived a life that appeared ordinary, even quiet, but beneath the surface, a dark obsession festered. Wanda was a woman in her 30s, single, and meticulous. Neighbors described her as polite, reserved, and diligent. She kept her apartment spotless, her meals prepared with care, and her routines precise. Yet those who observed her closely noted something unusual, a fascination with health, medicine, and substances that could alter life itself. She collected powders, tinctures, and pills, labeling them with careful handwriting, as if cataloging the world around her. Her fixation soon extended to her personal relationships. Wanda became attached to a small circle of men she regarded with affection, but also suspicion. Her behavior was subtle at first, small interventions in their diets, advice on medications, concern for minor ailments. Each action appeared helpful, even caring. But over months, the line between assistance and interference blurred. The first signs of tragedy appeared quietly. A man named Merrick, a friend and occasional lover, complained of unusual fatigue, nausea, and abdominal pain. Wanda prepared remedies, powders, and herbal infusions, ensuring he took them daily. Within weeks, Marek's health deteriorated rapidly. Doctors noted unexplained symptoms, severe digestive distress, persistent weakness, and sudden weight loss. Wanda was always nearby, attending to him, offering care with measured concern. Similar patterns emerged with other acquaintances. Friends reported Wanda's insistence on overseeing medications, controlling diets, and administering various treatments herself. Each incident culminated in worsening health, sometimes requiring hospitalization. Investigators later identified traces of arsenic and other toxic substances in victim systems. Each administration was deliberate, concealed within meals, drinks, or tablets, and executed with meticulous attention to detail. Police involvement escalated after repeated hospitalizations and deaths. Forensic testing confirmed elevated levels of poison in several victims. Wanda's apartment was searched. Containers of powders, bottles, and labeled medications were seized. Handwriting on labels matched her own. Receipts showed unusual purchases of chemicals that could be toxic if misused. Every piece of evidence reinforced the growing suspicion of premeditation. Neighbors testified to subtle behaviors that initially seemed innocuous. Wanda frequently checked on men who appeared ill, measuring doses herself, ensuring they followed instructions, and recording symptoms in notebooks. Friends described her as attentive, sometimes obsessively so, yet no one initially suspected deadly intent. It was the accumulation of incidents that created an unmistakable pattern. The investigation revealed a chilling consistency. Symptoms among victims: nausea, dizziness, abdominal pain, and sudden weakness, aligned with exposure to arsenic and other toxins. The timing, doses, and preparation methods indicated careful planning rather than accidental exposure. Wanda's routines, previously seen as methodical housekeeping, became inseparable from the means of harm. When arrested, Wanda initially denied wrongdoing. She claimed her actions were motivated by care and concern, that the substances were harmless or medicinal. Police, however, presented evidence of repeated poisonings, lab results, and witness testimony. Gradually, the scale of her actions became undeniable. The trial drew attention across Poland. The courtroom was tense, filled with curious spectators, reporters, and family members of victims. Witnesses described Wanda's meticulous administration of substances, her close monitoring of symptoms, and the progression from minor illness to critical deterioration. Prosecutors emphasized the repeated nature of the poisonings, each instance carefully concealed within the ordinary routines of daily life. Forensic experts detailed the effects of the substances used, explaining how each dose contributed to declining health. Photos of victims, medical records, and chemical analyses formed the backbone of the case. Witnesses recalled conversations where Wanda had advised against outside medical intervention, insisting she could manage treatment herself. Every detail, small or large, reinforced the narrative of calculated action. The defense argued a lack of intent to kill, suggesting accidental overdose or misunderstanding of medical treatment. They highlighted Wanda's apparent care and attentiveness, her insistence on supervising medications, and her polite demeanor. Yet the evidence, repeated exposures, consistent symptoms, and traceable poisons, made a compelling case for deliberate harm. After weeks of testimony, the court delivered a verdict: guilty on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Wanda Stavitsky was sentenced to life imprisonment. The outcome was a stark reminder of the lethal consequences that could emerge from obsessive control, meticulous routines, and hidden intent. Investigators reconstructed Wanda's methods in detail. Victims often received meals or drinks laced with poison. Pills were disguised, powders mixed into foods, and herbal infusions administered under the guise of care. Every interaction, every act of attention masked deadly intent. Witnesses later described her calm, almost clinical demeanor as she carried out these actions, reinforcing the chilling precision of her crimes. The apartments Wanda lived in became central to the investigation. Each room held traces of chemicals, notebooks with records of doses, and evidence of careful planning. The ordinary domestic spaces, kitchens, living rooms, and bedrooms were transformed into sites of meticulous execution. Files, lab reports, and witness statements documented the full scope of her actions, creating a clear and detailed narrative of murder. The case drew intense media coverage. Newspapers recounted her behavior, the sequence of poisonings, and the courtroom drama. Readers were captivated by the contrast between Wanda's ordinary appearance and the extraordinary violence she enacted. The story's appeal lay in the precision, planning, and cold calculation evident in each poisoning, a domestic horror executed with near-clinical method. Forensic details included analysis of powders, liquid infusions, and purchased chemicals. Patterns emerged: repeated victim selection, careful timing, and attention to avoiding detection. Each instance reinforced the methodical nature of the crimes. Witness testimony documented interactions with Wanda, her insistence on controlling care, and the escalating severity of symptoms. The sequence of events, recorded in police files, provided a chillingly complete picture. The verdict ended the trial, but the story of Wanda Stavitsky remained vivid. Files, photographs, and chemical analyses preserve the events in precise detail. The horror of the murders rests not in abstract reflection, but in the concrete, methodical actions of a single individual. Careful preparation, deliberate administration of poison, and the transformation of ordinary domestic acts into lethal instruments. Next story: Russian killer dentist, murder in the clinic. Moscow, late 1990s. The city pulsed with change. Neon signs flickered over crumbling sidewalks. Trams rattled along worn tracks, and the air carried the sharp scent of exhaust and winter frost. In a modest clinic tucked between residential blocks, Dr. Simayanov, a dentist with a calm demeanor and meticulous habits, prepared for another day of work. Patients arrived expecting routine care: cleanings, fillings, examinations. Behind the white walls and sterilized instruments, Dr. Simayanov maintained an air of professionalism. But colleagues would later recall moments that seemed odd: a sharp glance at certain patients, prolonged attention to medical records, and an unusual interest in medication and anesthesia dosages. It began subtly. Patients reported post-procedure complications beyond what could be explained by normal dentistry: nausea, dizziness, fainting. Some complained of sharp abdominal pain or unexplained infections. A few died, though initially their deaths were attributed to pre-existing conditions or complications from procedures. By 1998, patterns emerged. Several patients had received treatment in the same clinic, often from the same dentist. The common thread was Simayanov himself. Every case connected directly to him. Investigators noted a consistency in timing, symptoms, and the progression of illness. Subtle details and medical logs hinted at deliberate interference. A breakthrough occurred when a nurse, uneasy with repeated complications, alerted authorities. She reported noticing unusual substances in patient medications, powders added to anesthetics, and syringes prepared without standard documentation. Her testimony prompted an official investigation. Police obtained warrants to search the clinic. Cabinets were found containing unmarked containers, powders, and liquids not used in normal dental procedures. Some substances were later confirmed as potent toxins capable of inducing cardiac arrest or organ failure. Instruments bore traces of chemicals inconsistent with standard practice. Investigators interviewed surviving patients. One recalled fainting immediately after anesthesia, experiencing convulsions while Semyonov remained nearby, observing. Another described persistent vomiting and weakness for days after a simple filling, despite no prior health issues. Patterns across multiple cases became undeniable. Authorities reconstructed procedures. Records, notes, and receipts documented unusual purchases of chemicals. Syringes, anesthesia machines, and dental tools were examined for contamination. Lab tests confirmed lethal doses of toxins had been administered intentionally to several patients. The scope of the crimes became horrifying. Semyonov had targeted patients selectively, often those who were compliant, vulnerable, or easily influenced. His methodical approach ensured minimal suspicion at first. Small mistakes in technique or dosage could be explained away. But repeated incidents, overlapping victims, and forensic evidence left little doubt of premeditation. Arrest came swiftly after the accumulation of evidence. Semyonov was taken from the clinic quietly, his demeanor unchanged. Colleagues were shocked. He appeared calm, polite, even cooperative, despite the gravity of the accusations. Authorities charged him with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. The trial drew intense public attention. Moscow newspapers reported the chilling details. Patients poisoned under the guise of routine care, a trusted professional exploiting his position, and deaths that might have been prevented. Witnesses testified about symptoms, procedures, and suspicious behaviors. The courtroom was tense, packed with journalists and families of victims. Forensic experts presented lab findings, showing toxic residues in syringes, medication bottles, and patients' blood. Each chemical was linked to a specific set of symptoms. Experts reconstructed how Semyonov had mixed substances with anesthesia, carefully controlling doses to induce severe illness or death. Every detail pointed to careful planning and precise execution. Witnesses described his meticulous habits. He wore gloves, sterilized instruments, and recorded procedures in notebooks, maintaining appearances of professionalism. At the same time, subtle manipulations of drugs and doses were deliberate, concealed under routine tasks. The duality, calm professional and covert killer, fascinated and horrified observers. Prosecution laid out a timeline of events. Victims were treated, symptoms developed, and outcomes recorded. Repetition of method, consistency in chemical use, and selective targeting created a narrative of deliberate, methodical murder. Defense attorneys argued accidental overdoses, procedural errors, or unexplained complications. But evidence and patterns were overwhelming. The verdict was conviction. Life imprisonment was handed down. The details of the case, meticulously recorded, tested, and presented, created a chilling record of premeditated murder in a professional setting. Dr. Semyonov's actions transformed a place of healing into a site of danger, exploiting trust and routine with lethal efficiency. Investigators reconstructed every procedure, doses administered, chemicals mixed, and patient interactions recorded. Photos of contaminated instruments, forensic analysis of chemicals, and patient testimonies created a timeline of horror. The clinic, once ordinary, became synonymous with hidden danger. The Russian killer dentist case is remembered not for abstract reflection, but for the precise sequence of deadly events, the cold execution of toxic administration, and the meticulous planning behind each act. Patients walked in for care and left with illness, injury, or death, never anticipating the danger lurking beneath the sterilized surfaces. Next story, Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins, Poison, Greed, and Murder. Buffalo, New York, the 1890s. Horse-drawn carriages rattled along cobblestone streets. Street lamps flickered at dusk, casting long shadows on brick facades. In a modest neighborhood, Two women lived lives that appeared ordinary to neighbors. Catherine Flanagan, widow and housekeeper, and Margaret Higgins, her close friend, shared domestic duties, gossip, and meals. On the surface, their lives were simple, routine, and quiet. But beneath the ordinary, darkness simmered. Both women harbored ambitions that extended beyond household chores. They had keen eyes for valuables, cash, and the slightest opportunity for gain. Their schemes were subtle, calculated, and disguised by everyday tasks: cooking, cleaning, and caring for children or elderly neighbors. It began with illness in the households they touched. Children and elderly individuals under their care fell sick suddenly. Vomiting, weakness, and stomach pains became common complaints. At first, neighbors and doctors assumed natural causes: poor sanitation, seasonal flu, or common infection. Yet patterns emerged, uncomfortably precise. Catherine and Margaret's methods were meticulous. They prepared meals with care, measured ingredients with accuracy, and administered powders disguised as medicine or supplements. Victims consumed these doses unknowingly. Within hours, days, or sometimes weeks, symptoms escalated. Some died quietly in their beds, leaving neighbors puzzled and frightened. Investigators noted the consistency. Deaths often coincided with visits from Catherine or Margaret. Beverages were consumed under their supervision. Pills and powders appeared in meals they prepared. Toxicology, though rudimentary at the time, revealed arsenic in several victims. Neighbors recalled the women's insistence on handling certain tasks personally, a habit now chilling in retrospect. The first documented suspicious death occurred in 1891. A young child under Margaret Higgins' temporary care fell gravely ill. Witnesses described Margaret's calm response: soothing words, careful administration of powders, and attentive observation. Despite her demeanor, the child's condition worsened rapidly. By the next morning, the child was dead. Similar incidents followed. Catherine's victims were often elderly or infirm. Her attention to their meals, medicines, and daily routines concealed the lethal intent beneath ordinary care. Investigators later found that she had acquired arsenic and other substances legally, used in small doses to avoid immediate detection. Every act was calculated to appear routine, helpful, or medically justified. Neighbors began to whisper. Deaths seemed too frequent, coinciding with the women's presence. Some reported seeing unusual powders, small containers, or bottles with faded labels in kitchens. Others noted a strange insistence on administering meals or remedies personally. Each detail, small at first, accumulated into a pattern of suspicion. Police became involved after multiple deaths in the same districts. The authorities examined homes, interviewed witnesses, and tested samples from victims' meals. Arsenic traces were discovered, linking the women to the poisonings. The investigation was painstaking. In a time before advanced forensics, detectives relied on witness testimony, purchase records, and careful observation of the women's behavior. Catherine and Margaret were arrested. The process was quiet but intense. Officers seized containers of powders, receipts for chemicals, and personal notes documenting the women's actions. Witnesses were called to testify about interactions, meals, and administered remedies. Each account reinforced the emerging picture of premeditated harm disguised by domestic normality. During the trial, the courtroom brimmed with tension. The prosecution outlined the sequence of deaths, patterns of administration, and evidence of arsenic. Testimony detailed how both women controlled meals, medicines, and daily routines with careful oversight. Witnesses recounted symptoms in victims: vomiting, fatigue, dizziness, and their correlation with ingestion of poison substances. Defense attorneys argued accident, misunderstanding, or coincidence. They emphasized the women's polite demeanor, helpfulness, and apparent care for those they served. But the repetition, documentation, and chemical evidence created an overwhelming case. Patterns were undeniable. Each act, while seemingly ordinary, became part of a clear and consistent narrative of lethal intent. Forensic teams reconstructed methods. Meals were analyzed. Powders and liquids were tested. Investigators charted doses, timing, and the sequence of illness in victims. Each small act, stirring a spoonful of powder into porridge, handing out tea, supervising medication intake, was documented. The picture that emerged was chilling. Ordinary domestic acts transformed into instruments of death. Both women were convicted on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Sentences were severe. Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins received terms reflecting the scale and premeditation of their crimes. Their calm, orderly appearances during trial contrasted sharply with the horror of the acts they had committed. The case drew national attention. Newspapers recounted the meticulous poisoning methods, the calculated selection of victims, and the ease with which ordinary domestic routines could mask lethal intent. The story fascinated readers for its combination of subtlety, calculation, and shocking outcomes. Investigators later reconstructed the timeline in full. Victims, often helpless or unaware, were given poisoned meals or medicines. Symptoms developed progressively, sometimes appearing natural. Each intervention, each small act of attention, became a piece of the lethal sequence. The domestic sphere, kitchens, dining rooms, and bedrooms, was transformed into a stage for premeditated murder. The case of Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins remains a stark illustration of how ordinary actions, when executed with precision and hidden intent, can produce extraordinary consequences. The shock lies in the combination of trust, routine, and careful planning, the very qualities that initially disguise their crimes. Every document, testimony, and chemical analysis preserves the sequence of events with chilling clarity. The streets of Brazil can be chaotic. Sao Paulo in the 1970s was no exception. Crowds surged through narrow avenues, buses rattled along cobblestone streets, and the neon lights of small shops flickered against the evening haze. Life moved fast, often without pause, and in that frenetic rhythm, danger could hide easily. Ordinary people hustled through the city unaware that, in the shadows, violence thrived, unnoticed yet omnipresent. Among the chaos, one man moved with purpose. Pedro Rodriguez Filho, later known as Padrinho Matador, was a product of a harsh environment. Poverty and neglect shaped him, but so did brutality. His father was a criminal, often absent, leaving young Pedro to navigate a world where survival demanded cunning, aggression, and sometimes violence. By the time he reached adolescence, the line between life and death was already something he understood intimately. He began killing early. His first victims were often gang members, petty criminals, or local bullies, a mix of revenge and opportunity. He developed an instinct for reading fear, for sensing vulnerability. Each action was deliberate. Each choice was measured. He learned quickly that power could be seized quietly and efficiently when others were unaware. Filho's killings were brutal, yet they followed a certain order, a personal code. He kept a ledger in his mind, marking those he judged deserving of death. Corrupt policemen, rapists, drug dealers. To him, these are targets. Yet his morality was fractured. Sometimes innocence died. Sometimes vengeance blurred with impulse. Each act of violence was a reflection of a mind both calculating and chaotic, trained to react without hesitation, to execute with certainty. His methods evolved. Knives, firearms, ambushes, deception. Each choice was tailored to the target. He buried bodies in shallow graves or forests, hid them along quiet roads, sometimes returning to observe, to confirm. He studied the consequences of his actions as obsessively as he executed them. In the labyrinthine streets of Sao Paulo, he became a shadow, both part of the city and apart from it. By the time authorities became aware, Filho had amassed dozens of victims. Official records account for at least 71 murders, though he claimed the number was far higher, some say over 100. Unlike many serial killers, he was not content with random killings. Each had reasoning, each had motive, personal or ideological. Patterns existed, but they were erratic enough to confuse police and terrorize communities. He preferred nightfall. Streets emptied, shadows thickened, and the ordinary bustle of life masked his movements. Yet by day, he was indistinguishable from neighbors or coworkers. Polite, quiet, observant, invisible. It was this duality that allowed him to evade detection for so long. Even incarceration did not diminish his reach. Behind bars, Filio continued to orchestrate killings. Rival inmates were threatened, punished, or eliminated according to his plan. Messages were delivered, warnings were heeded. His presence, even in confinement, was lethal, a reminder that some predators cannot be contained within walls. Psychologists and criminologists studied him, fascinated by his contradictions. Some saw a vigilante, a man exacting justice when the system failed. Others saw a psychopath, a person for whom human life was expendable, a chess player treating people as pieces. What made him distinct was not just the brutality, but the efficiency, the foresight, the adaptability. He was a predator who observed patterns, calculated risks, and understood instinctively how fear could be weaponized. His eventual capture brought temporary relief to Sao Paulo. But even then, his legend persisted. Families of victims carried trauma that would never fade. Criminals whispered his name in fear. News of his deeds crossed international borders. Scholars dissected his psychology. Filmmakers would later dramatize parts of his story, but reality remained stranger, darker, and more precise than fiction. Walking through the streets of Brazil today, it is still possible to sense the ghosts of that era. In the dim glow of street lamps, in the quiet alleyways, one can almost imagine him moving through the crowd, calculating, waiting, patient. Each step measured, each action premeditated. A man forged by neglect and brutality, who in turn reshaped the lives of hundreds, leaving behind a trail of terror that would echo for decades. Filio's story is not simply chilling for the acts themselves, but for the mind behind them. A mind capable of observation, analysis, and relentless execution. He understood human behavior intimately, how trust could be manipulated, how fear could be cultivated, how chaos could be used as camouflage. And he acted on that understanding without remorse. In the stillness of night, the story of Pedrinho Matador lingers. A warning, a fascination, a glimpse into the consequences of a world where cruelty breeds cruelty, and where ordinary streets can conceal extraordinary darkness. Next story, Belle Gunness, the Lady Bluebeard of Indiana. LaPorte, Indiana, early 1900s. Snow fell steadily over the quiet farm roads. The wind whistled through skeletal trees, and smoke curled from chimneys of scattered homes. One farmhouse, large and imposing despite its rural location, belonged to Belle Gunness, a woman whose reputation would soon be synonymous with horror. Belle was striking, tall, strong, and confident. Neighbors described her as industrious and independent, running her farm efficiently while caring for her children. She welcomed boarders and suitors with warmth, though beneath the surface, she maintained secrets that would eventually shock the nation. The first suspicious events occurred subtly. Men who visited Belle often disappeared without explanation. Payments, inheritances, and personal belongings vanished alongside them. Locals whispered, but few dared confront her. On the surface, she appeared to live an ordinary, even industrious life, tending crops, feeding animals, and managing the household with exacting precision. It was not until neighbors reported unusual smells and activity around the farmhouse that suspicion intensified. In particular, the handling of hired help and boarders drew attention. Several young men were seen visiting, arriving in the daytime, and never leaving. Investigators later pieced together accounts from family, friends, and neighbors, forming a disturbing pattern. Inside the house, Belle's methods were precise and calculated. She maintained a large cauldron in a separate shed, ostensibly for farm purposes, but later examination revealed it had been used to dispose of bodies. Victims were lured under the guise of work, employment, or marriage, then killed in ways designed to obscure cause. Financial gain was a clear motive. Life insurance policies, cash, and valuable possessions vanished with each death. The first documented case involved a suitor named Peter Gunness, Belle's alleged husband. His disappearance raised questions, but documentation was limited. Subsequent arrivals, men seeking work or companionship, similarly vanished. Authorities noted that Belle's farm operations provided plausible cover. Noise from animals, the bustle of farm work, and isolated location made scrutiny difficult. Neighbors later reported strange occurrences. The stench of decay, masked by fires, movements in the barn at odd hours, and occasional distant screams. Though these accounts were anecdotal at first, combined with missing persons reports, a pattern of suspicion emerged. The investigation intensified after a fire consumed part of Belle's farmhouse. Firefighters found remnants of bodies and personal effects, suggesting attempts to destroy evidence. Among the remains were bones and clothing that matched descriptions of missing men. The scene was gruesome, fragments scattered, evidence of attempts to conceal multiple murders. Police interviews revealed Belle's manipulative skill. She had lured victims using charm, promises of work, and appeals to companionship or love. Once trust was established, she controlled meals, access to weapons, and isolation. Methods of murder included bludgeoning, poisoning, and in some cases, firearms. Every act was executed to ensure minimal witnesses and maximal concealment. Investigators pieced together timelines. Victims arrived on specific days, sometimes coordinated with payments or the issuance of life insurance policies. Belle's meticulous record-keeping revealed an organized sequence: collection of insurance, disposal of bodies, management of the household, and continued recruitment of new victims. Her duality, outwardly charming, inwardly lethal, fascinated law enforcement. Neighbors testified to her presence on days of disappearances, often maintaining normal routines while chaos unfolded in hidden corners of the property. Farmhands reported peculiar behavior: excessive cleaning of certain areas, trips to outbuildings at odd hours, and strict oversight of visitors. These details, combined with forensic evidence from the burned farmhouse, created a clear narrative of premeditated homicide. The full scale of Belle's crimes became evident with exhumation and forensic analysis. Bones found in shallow graves, remnants in the fire-damaged shed, and personal effects linked to missing men provided overwhelming proof. Insurance policies confirmed financial gain, and witness statements corroborated the sequence of disappearances. Every detail pointed to deliberate, calculated murder over many years. Belle's arrest was dramatic. Police arrived at the farm, observing her demeanor carefully. She remained outwardly calm, attempting explanations that initially seemed plausible. Yet evidence was irrefutable. She was taken into custody, and subsequent interrogation revealed partial admissions, though she continued to obfuscate full details of the murders. The trial captured national attention. Newspapers documented the gruesome findings: bones discovered in ashes, bodies buried on the property, and victims' possessions traced to Belle's possession. Witnesses recounted her charm, manipulations, and coercion. Experts detailed the forensic findings, explaining how evidence from fire-damaged areas and shallow graves proved multiple murders. Prosecution emphasized premeditation, methodical execution, and financial motive. Belle's calm exterior and outward industriousness only heightened public fascination. Defense attorneys attempted to frame her as misunderstood or unaccountable, but evidence was overwhelming. Documentation, witness testimony, and forensic proof painted a consistent narrative of cold, deliberate murder. The case concluded with conviction. Belle Gunness' crimes were recognized as among the most extensive for a single perpetrator in American history at the time. Life imprisonment, though controversial, reflected the severity and scale of her acts. Her farmhouse, once a symbol of rural independence, became infamous as the site of calculated, repeated murder. Forensic documentation preserved the sequence of events with chilling clarity. Victims were lured, controlled, killed, and concealed systematically. Each death followed a pattern: arrival, manipulation, execution, and disposal. Items such as clothing, personal effects, and insurance records confirmed identities and motives. Investigators meticulously reconstructed the timeline, revealing the full scope of her crimes. Neighbors continued to recount the horror. The contrast between Belle's outward normalcy and hidden brutality created lasting fascination. Every small detail, the arrangement of rooms, the sequence of meals, the meticulous disposal of bodies, highlighted the precision of her criminal methods. Her story endures not because of abstract reflection, but because of the stark, shocking reality of calculated murder disguised as ordinary domestic life. Next story, Florence Maybrick, the poison trial that captivated England. Liverpool, 1889. The city smelled of coal, salt water, and smoke from the docks. Narrow streets twisted between brick tenements and warehouses. Horse-drawn carts clattered over cobblestones. Steam hissed from factories. Somewhere in this bustling chaos, the Maybrick household maintained an appearance of calm, a neat facade hiding the growing tension inside. Florence Maybrick moved quietly through the rooms of her home. Young, elegant, and intelligent, she was the daughter of a well-to-do family, accustomed to social circles and polite society. Her husband, James Maybrick, a wealthy cotton merchant, was often irritable, prone to complaints about health and comfort. The household staff tiptoed around moods and arguments, attentive to his whims, while Florence balanced propriety with an undercurrent of frustration. By the spring of 1889, James Maybrick's health had declined sharply. Sudden nausea, weakness, and fainting spells plagued him. Friends and family grew concerned. Servants noticed that Florence spent long periods preparing his medications, powders, tinctures, and tonics, with meticulous care. Each dose seemed harmless, routine. Yet James's symptoms worsened, alarming physicians who struggled to identify the cause. One night, he collapsed in his bedroom, clutching his stomach. Panic rippled through the household. Servants summoned doctors immediately. Florence remained calm, her hands steady as she guided them through the medicines administered that day. The physicians examined the powders, questioned the household staff, and took notes. Yet the illness was mysterious, escalating with alarming speed. Chemical analysis eventually revealed arsenic in James Maybrick's system. The discovery sparked suspicion. Arsenic was common in Victorian remedies, but the levels found were lethal. Police arrived to investigate. Every room, every drawer, every bottle was scrutinized. Letters, receipts, and pharmacy records were collected. Florence, still poised, became the focus of inquiries. Observers whispered of her proximity to the powders, her knowledge of dosing, and the quiet efficiency with which she managed the household. Florence was arrested. The trial began later that year, drawing crowds from Liverpool and beyond. The courtroom was tense, filled with reporters, locals, and curious onlookers. Every movement, glance, and gesture was noted. Witnesses described Florence's behavior before and during James's illness. Her attention to medication, her composure during crises, and the unusual calm she displayed while others panicked. Prosecutors argued this suggested deliberate intent. Evidence relied heavily on circumstantial details. The sequence of illness, timing of medication, and Florence's presence in the room were examined meticulously. Handwriting comparisons on prescriptions, records of arsenic purchases, and testimony from pharmacists became central points. Observers in court whispered about the quiet efficiency of her household routines, meals served, powders prepared, and the rituals of daily life, now reframed as potential mechanisms of harm. The defense countered with the ambiguity of arsenic's presence. It was common in medicines, tonics, and household items. They emphasized the possibility of accidental overdose or contamination. Florence's calmness, they argued, was ordinary behavior under the pressures of Victorian domestic life, not proof of malice. Each side presented its case with vigor, leaving jurors to weigh technical chemistry against human behavior and social expectations. As testimony unfolded, subtle tension gripped the courtroom. Witnesses described James Maybrick's erratic health, the daily administration of medicines, and the household dynamics. Small details, a misplaced teaspoon, a forgotten dose, or a note from a pharmacist, took on dramatic weight under scrutiny. Spectators leaned forward, sensing that ordinary actions had become dangerous, that domestic life could conceal lethal potential. After weeks of examination, the jury reached a verdict, guilty of murder. Florence was sentenced to death in 1889. Public reaction was immediate. Newspapers debated the evidence, the fairness of the trial, and the implications of a woman's potential agency in domestic crime. Petitions for clemency circulated. The case divided opinion. Some insisted on her guilt, others saw the sentence as excessive and based on circumstantial interpretation. Years later, after petitions and public attention, Florence's sentence was commuted and she was released in 1904. She left Liverpool quietly, remade her life, and largely vanished from public view. But the story of James Maybrick's decline, the mysterious powders, and the sensational trial lingered in memory, not as reflection or moral lesson, but as a vivid recounting of tension, calculation, and human uncertainty. The Maybrick household, once orderly and elegant, had become a scene of suspicion. Every drawer, bottle, and ledger documented a life at once meticulous and fragile. Florence's movements, her attention to daily routines, and her proximity to the fatal substances painted a narrative of intimate access. The home itself, a space of comfort and care, transformed into a stage for a deadly mystery. Liverpool streets remained crowded, noisy, and smoky, yet the story unfolded in private rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms. The public, however, experienced the drama through courtroom reporting, serialized accounts, and gossip. The fascination was immediate. The mixture of wealth, domestic detail, potential poison, and social standing created a story that captivated readers and listeners alike. Florence Maybrick's story concludes in quiet ambiguity. She survived imprisonment, avoided execution, and moved into private life. Yet the events of 1889, the illness, the powders, the trial, remain vivid historical episodes. There is no moral summary here, no reflection on psychology or justice. The story is of illness, suspicion, meticulous observation, and the dramatic unfolding of events that gripped a city. Up next is Michael Lewis, chemotherapy sabotage case. Hospitals are sanctuaries for those fighting the most fragile battles. Cancer patients who enter their doors burdened with fear, pain, and hope. They trust in the professionals who administer treatments that can mean life or death. In France, during the late 1990s and early 2000s, one man breached that sacred trust in a chillingly deliberate way. Michael Lewis, a nurse in oncology wards, turned care into a weapon and chemotherapy into a mechanism of harm. Michael Lewis worked in multiple oncology units in France, tending to patients undergoing chemotherapy. Colleagues described him as diligent, professional, and personable. He appeared committed to the grueling work of oncology nursing, administering intravenous therapies, monitoring vital signs, and providing reassurance to patients terrified by the uncertainties of cancer treatment. To supervisors, he seemed reliable. To patients and families, he seemed a compassionate caregiver. Yet behind this outward facade, Lewis harbored a disturbing compulsion. Investigations revealed that he deliberately altered chemotherapy drugs, sabotaging treatments in ways that caused unnecessary suffering, accelerated deterioration, and, in some cases, death. Patients who should have received precise doses for therapeutic effect instead experienced overdoses, underdoses, or substituted substances that worsened their condition. The results were insidious: pain, prolonged hospitalizations, and unexplained declines that initially confounded colleagues and doctors. The first anomalies were subtle. Oncologists noticed that some patients were not responding to standard chemotherapy protocols, or that responses were inconsistent. Laboratory results sometimes contradicted the expected effects of administered drugs. Yet in busy wards, With staff overworked and patients critically ill, initial suspicions were dismissed. Oncology treatment is inherently complex. Adverse reactions are common, and errors can be attributed to human fallibility rather than deliberate interference. Patterns emerged only after careful retrospective analysis. Mortality and complication rates were disproportionately high for patients under Lewis's care. Logs revealed irregularities in drug preparation and administration, often coinciding with the shifts. Families recounted rapid declines, sometimes after treatments that were expected to stabilize conditions. The consistency of these anomalies eventually led hospital administrators to launch an internal investigation. The methods of sabotage were methodical. Lewis sometimes diluted drugs, reducing their effectiveness. Other times, he substituted chemotherapy with inert substances or agents that exacerbated illness. In certain cases, he intentionally administered drugs at lethal concentrations, causing severe toxicity. The manipulation was subtle enough to evade immediate detection, but devastating in cumulative effect. Investigators pieced together patient histories, treatment logs, and staff testimonies. They found a chilling pattern. Children and adults, male and female, suffering from various cancers, experienced unexpected toxicities or therapeutic failures during Lewis's shifts. He often blended seamlessly into the daily routine, assisting with patient care while orchestrating harm with a quiet precision that escaped immediate notice. When confronted, Lewis initially denied wrongdoing. His calm demeanor persisted, even as investigators presented detailed evidence of deliberate interference. Eventually, forensic analysis of drug samples, pharmacy records, and patient outcomes revealed the scope of his sabotage. It became clear that his actions were intentional, not merely negligent, and that the resulting harm was extensive. The trial that followed captivated both the medical community and the public. Families recounted harrowing experiences of their loved ones enduring unnecessary suffering. Oncologists described confusion and frustration as treatments repeatedly failed, sometimes in patterns that only hindsight revealed. Evidence demonstrated that Lewis had exploited his position of trust, access to drugs, and the high-pressure environment of oncology wards to perpetrate his scheme. Ultimately, Michael Lewis was convicted of multiple counts of patient endangerment and manslaughter. He received a substantial prison sentence, reflecting both the severity of harm and the betrayal inherent in targeting vulnerable patients. Regulatory bodies reinforce standards for drug preparation, administration oversight, and independent checks, emphasizing the importance of multi-layered safeguards in oncology units. The human toll of Lewis's actions cannot be overstated. Patients suffered unnecessarily, enduring intensified pain, prolonged illness, and emotional distress. Families struggled to reconcile their grief with the knowledge that a trusted caregiver had caused harm rather than alleviating it. Staff who work alongside Lewis reported a mixture of guilt, disbelief, and fear that such deliberate acts could occur undetected in a high-stakes clinical environment. The case also prompted wider reflection within the healthcare sector. It highlighted vulnerabilities in hospital systems, dependence on individual integrity, insufficient oversight in drug administration, and the challenges of detecting deliberate malfeasance amid the complexities of oncology treatment. Hospitals revised policies, implemented redundant verification procedures, and increased training for staff on recognizing irregularities. Even today, the story of Michael Lewis is cited as a cautionary tale. Oncologists and nurses are reminded that vigilance must extend beyond clinical skill to include awareness of colleague behavior, adherence to protocols, and the courage to question anomalies, even when they appear minor or when the person involved is respected. In oncology wards across France and beyond, the legacy of the case remains palpable. Children and adults now benefit from enhanced safeguards, but the memory of those who suffered under Lewis's manipulations lingers in the minds of families, staff, and administrators alike. The quiet, clinical corridors of hospitals, once scenes of covert sabotage, serve as a reminder that trust, while essential, must always be paired with accountability. Michael Lewis did not act in isolation. He exploited systemic weaknesses, relied on access and authority, and manipulated the very tools meant to save life. His actions reveal a dark truth. Even in the most sacred spaces of care, human malice or compulsion can create devastation, and vigilance, oversight, and ethical courage are the only shield between trust and tragedy. The next story will give you the chills. Some crimes unfold in hospitals, some in quiet neighborhoods, and some in offices that appear entirely ordinary. This is the story of Dr. Michael Mastromarino, a dentist who traded drills and dental chairs for refrigeration units and hidden freezers, turning human remains into a black market commodity and exploiting trust in the most personal of ways, the treatment of the dead. New Jersey in the early 2000s seemed like any other region in America. Suburban streets, medical offices on corner lots, families living out ordinary routines. It was in this environment, amid trust in medical professionals and quiet neighborhoods, that Michael Mastromarino began a practice few could have imagined. By day, he was a licensed dentist, running a modest office where patients came for cleanings, fillings, and routine oral care. But beneath the professional veneer lay a network of illegal activity that would shock the nation. Mastromarino's operation did not begin with sudden malice. According to his own admissions, it started with opportunity and ambition. He partnered with a small funeral home to harvest bone, tissue, and organs from cadavers before the families knew. He manipulated consent forms, sometimes obtaining signatures after death, other times convincing families that donation was part of standard post-mortem procedures. His pitch was plausible. Tissue would be used for research, for life-saving transplants, for advancing medicine. Few questioned it. The mechanics of the operation were precise. Bodies arrived at the dental office, unassuming and unguarded, stored in refrigerators that looked like ordinary commercial units. Staff, sometimes employees unaware of the legality, sometimes complicit, assisted in the processing, separating bones, tendons, and tissue. Mastromarino would then sell the harvested parts to tissue companies across the United States, generating profits far exceeding legitimate dental practice income. The first signs of impropriety emerged not from law enforcement, but from the families of the deceased. Relatives began noticing inconsistencies, missing body parts, unexplained incisions, cremations that revealed bones absent or incomplete. Funeral directors noticed irregularities in deliveries and transport logs. Complaints trickled in sporadically, but without direct evidence of wrongdoing. Investigation stalled. Mastromarino's charm and professional status shielded him. He was personable, courteous, and persuasive, qualities that disguised illicit intent. Over time, the scale of the operation expanded. Mastromarino established contracts with medical schools, research facilities, and tissue processors, all eager to acquire bone and tissue without always verifying consent. In his own recounting, he believed he was operating in a gray area, a blurred intersection of legality, demand, and opportunity. But by 2003, evidence suggested a more disturbing truth. Some body parts had been harvested without any consent whatsoever. Families, expecting a complete burial or cremation, discovered violations that could not be undone. Investigators began to trace the trail of violations, uncovering the full scope of the scheme. Documentation showed repeated manipulation of consent forms, fraudulent records, and consistent misrepresentation of the purpose for which tissues were being used. Autopsies confirmed missing bone, tendons, and tissue in bodies that had been entrusted to Mastromarino's care. The physical evidence, once collected, painted a grim picture. Dozens of victims, all post-mortem, all exploited, all with families deceived in the most intimate way possible. The arrest came in 2005 after authorities received corroborated complaints from multiple funeral homes and families. Mastromarino did not resist. Interviews revealed a man capable of rationalizing his actions. He spoke of entrepreneurship, of supplying medical research, of meeting demand. Yet he also admitted to knowing the violations of law he had committed. When pressed about the consent of families, he offered a mixture of evasions and half-truths, reflecting a man aware of the moral consequences, but calculating enough to minimize them. The trial that followed captivated the public. Media coverage detailed the mechanics of the operation, the disturbing casualness with which human remains have been treated, and the exploitation of trust in a domain typically immune to suspicion. Mastro Marino's defense argued for misunderstanding and oversight, attempting to portray him as a businessman navigating poorly defined regulations. Prosecutors highlighted the deliberate nature of the fraud, the disregard for consent, and the psychological impact on families who discover their loved ones have been violated in death. By the conclusion of the proceedings, Mastro Marino was sentenced to 38 years in federal prison. His co-conspirators, including employees of the funeral homes and tissue processing companies, also received sentences ranging from probation to several years of imprisonment. The case prompted sweeping reforms in the regulation of tissue donation and medical ethics oversight. Consent procedures were tightened, auditing systems implemented, and criminal liability for illicit harvesting clearly established. Yet the human dimension of the case remained haunting. Families recounted the profound violation they felt, seeing their loved one's body returned incomplete, discovering that tissues meant for sacred repose had been commodified, recognizing that trust had been exploited in the most intimate of circumstances. Funeral directors and medical professionals spoke of shock, disbelief, and a lingering fear of malpractice hidden behind legitimate seeming practice. Mastro Marino's operation was calculated, meticulous, and sustained over years. It was not violent in the traditional sense. There were no chases, no weapons, no physical assault. Yet the harm was profound, emotional, psychological, and spiritual. It demonstrated how professional authority, when corrupted, can create a network of exploitation invisible to the casual observer. Trust, in this case, was weaponized, and the most sacred moment, death, was transformed into an avenue for profit. Even today, the story lingers in medical and dental circles as a cautionary tale. It reminds practitioners of the profound responsibility that comes with access to human bodies, living or deceased. It reminds regulators that vigilance, audits, and consent verification are not mere formalities, but essential safeguards. And it reminds the public that even those who present themselves as healers can sometimes operate in ways that betray trust with devastating consequences. Mastro Marino's legacy is paradoxical. On the one hand, regulatory reforms protect the living and the dead. On the other hand, the lives already affected cannot be undone. Families continue to recount the shock of discovering that someone they trusted with the remains of a loved one had profited in violation of ethics, law, and humanity. The sanitized offices, the sterile equipment, the refrigerated freezers, once symbols of professional care, now evoke a cold reminder of how easily human dignity can be exploited when oversight fails. On to the next story. Amityville, Long Island, November 13th, 1974. The autumn wind whipped through the streets, rattling windows and carrying the scent of cold salt air from the nearby bay. On Ocean Avenue, a two-story colonial house stood with freshly painted shutters and a well-kept lawn. Inside, the DeFeo family slept, unaware that by morning, the household would be transformed into a scene of horror. Ronald DeFeo Jr., 23, had a tense morning routine, though few could have predicted the violence to come. The previous weeks had been marked by arguments, odd behavior, and increasing friction between him and his family. Friends described him as quiet, brooding, sometimes aggressive. Neighbors occasionally noticed him sitting alone, staring at the house or wandering along the streets late at night. Shortly after midnight, Ronald awoke. He moved with purpose through the darkened hallways, careful not to wake his younger siblings. He retrieved a .35 caliber Marlin rifle from a hidden corner of the house. Every movement was precise, controlled. A faint creak of the floorboards could have betrayed him, but the house was silent. One by one, he confronted members of his family. Louise, his mother, was sleeping in her room. 2 quick shots rang out. She fell without warning, and the silence returned. Next was his father, Ronald Sr., resting in the master bedroom. Another pair of shots echoed through the house. He collapsed, unarmed, unaware of the assault until it was too late. The younger siblings, Dawn, Allison, and Mark, were not spared. Each encountered the same methodical violence. The rifle was wielded with shocking precision. The bedroom doors, usually a barrier of safety, could not protect them. By the time the night ended, all 6 members of the DeFeo household were dead, their lives extinguished in the span of minutes. Neighbors, attuned to the quiet of Ocean Avenue, heard the shots and later called police. The early morning hours brought detectives to the scene. Officers noted the eerie stillness. A home once full of life, now silent except for the faint smell of gunpowder. Windows remained closed, beds untouched, and the ordinary routines of family life frozen in a moment of violence. Investigators quickly focused on Ronald DeFeo Jr. Evidence was immediate and compelling. He had been seen near the house the night of the murders. The rifle, found in his possession, matched the caliber of the bullets recovered. Fingerprints, powder residue, and eyewitness accounts aligned to place him as the sole perpetrator. When questioned, Ronald initially denied involvement. His calm demeanor, juxtaposed with the scene, unnerved officers. Over hours of interrogation, inconsistencies in his statements emerged. Eventually, he confessed, recounting the sequence of events in chilling detail. He claimed to have planned the murders in advance, noting each step with precision. The trial that followed was sensational. Courtrooms overflowed with spectators and media. Testimony included neighbors' accounts of Ronald's behavior, forensic analysis of the rifle, and details from the crime scene. Prosecutors emphasized the premeditation, the timing of shots, the selection of victims, and the concealment of weapons. Every element of the case highlighted the meticulous execution of the murders. Forensic teams reconstructed the night. Spent shell casings, bullet trajectories, and the positioning of bodies were carefully documented. Each bedroom, hallway, and doorway revealed clues. Investigators noted the sequence of shots, the angles, and the manner in which Ronald moved from room to room. The precision, coldness, and speed of the killings became central to understanding the case. Neighbors were called to testify about sounds and movements. Some had heard footsteps before the shots. Others noted the sudden silence afterward. A few recalled seeing Ronald awake in the hours leading up to the murders, acting unusually. Each observation, though minor alone, formed a mosaic of forewarning that no one fully recognized at the time. Throughout the trial, Ronald's demeanor remained consistent, detached, controlled, and eerily calm. Psychologists testified about his behavior, but the focus remained on factual evidence. The rifle, the sequence of events, the confessions, and the alignment of witness accounts. Every element contributed to the clear narrative of premeditated homicide. On November 21st, 1975, the jury reached its verdict. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was convicted of 6 counts of murder. Sentenced to life imprisonment, he would spend decades behind bars. The courtroom exhaled, the story of 112. Ocean Avenue became a grim touchstone for true crime in America. The house itself remained. For years afterward, neighbors avoided it, whispers of the killings circulating among locals. Rumors emerged of strange occurrences, cold drafts, unexplained noises, fleeting shadows. While media sensationalized these stories, the core of the horror remained the precise, deadly actions of a single night. A family killed in cold blood by one of its own. Investigators documented the scene in exhaustive detail. Blood spatter, bullet holes, and the positioning of furniture. Every room told part of the story, and forensic photos captured the chilling reality. The rifle, carefully maintained, remained central as both weapon and evidence. Files, witness statements, and confessions preserved the sequence of events with precision. The DeFeo murders became a reference point for criminologists, law enforcement, and journalists. Every element, motive, method, and aftermath, was studied for its brutality and efficiency. Ronald's life following conviction remained confined, yet the story of that night retained its clarity. A domestic scene turned deadly, a sequence of calculated actions leaving no room for escape. In the years that followed, 112 Ocean Avenue passed into history, its walls silent witnesses to the violence that occurred there. Visitors and journalists documented the property, capturing photographs and collecting testimony from neighbors. The events of that night continued to haunt local memory, not for lessons or moral reflection, but for the shock of the crime itself, the precise, chilling elimination of an entire family in their home.